When this guy was walking through Villa Renabu, a kid named Belder challenged him to a sword duel. Belder always used this as an excuse to beat Gray up and humiliate him in front of everyone. But this time, that humiliation was never going to happen again. Gray grabbed the sword and Belder attacked without even warning that the duel had started. Gray dodged every single attack with precision, something that had never happened before, and Belder felt that something was seriously off. Then things got even stranger when Gray closed his eyes waiting for an opening. With that one move, he knocked the sword right out of Belder's hands. The guy admitted he lost the fight, but that wasn't enough for Gray. He wasn't a coward anymore, and he needed to make sure everyone knew it. So he brought the sword down with full force, hitting the bully hard. Don't worry though, it was just a grazing hit. Gray is not the villain here. He wanted to teach a lesson. So he landed another hit using the flat of the blade and sent Belder flying. In the eyes of everyone watching, and especially in Belder's eyes, the coward kid from before now looked like the real threat in the room. The other guys decided to rush him all at once, thinking that maybe 4 against 1 would change things. It didn't. All 4 of them ended up with their heads ringing from too many hits to count. Gray then made it clear that from now on, none of them would ever treat him as inferior again. If that happened, they would end up like this leaf right here. And right in front of them, he sliced the leaf clean in half. Belder ran off immediately screaming that he needed to go change his underwear. The truth that none of them know is that Gray has a dark secret buried in his past. 15 years into the future, Gray would be part of a group of warriors assembled to face the greatest threat the world had ever seen, the Liquidator, a destroying entity that wiped an entire continent off the map like it was nothing. To fight this thing, the greatest warriors on Earth were brought together. A man who survived a giant's attack without a single scratch. A sage with power equal to an entire army. An archer who took down a high-level dragon with a single shot. And the strongest swordswoman who ever lived. Every single one of them was wiped out. Gray watched each of them fall without being able to do anything. He was the low-ranked soldier, the disposable pawn, the name nobody remembered. But when everything seemed to be over, something happened. A power that nobody could explain kept him alive when he should have been dead. An entity called Kronos appeared and told him one simple thing. Gray's power was stronger than the Liquidator's own power. The problem was he had no idea how to control it. So Gray was thrown back into the world with a black sword covered in red lightning and went straight at the monster. He managed to hurt the Liquidator, something none of the greatest warriors in the world had been able to do. But it still wasn't enough. The Liquidator was untouchable inside his own plane of power, and Gray had no real control over what he was carrying. That's when Kronos stepped in for good. Sent the Liquidator back in time and threw Gray even further into the past, so he could learn from scratch everything he never learned, and this time, get it right. Gray opened his eyes and he was in Villa Renabu, 15 years before any of it happened. And it was right there, in those very first moments back, that he ran into Belder and the gang. We already know how that ended. With all 4 of them on the ground begging for mercy, Gray put away his sword and looked at Belder. He had one simple request, a referral to the Shinsaira dojo. He needed a path to the greatest academy in the world, and that humiliated bully right in front of him was the fastest door he had. Belder ran towards the dojo to recommend him. Once in the city, Belder asked the protagonist the reason for his interest in the dojo. The protagonist explained that he was seeking a recommendation for the academy through that place. One of Belder's gang members commented that the protagonist already seemed strong enough, without the need to go to the academy. The protagonist, however, stated that his level of strength was far from ideal. After all, not even the world's greatest elite group had been able to defeat the Liquidator. Even when using his black swordsman power, he couldn't even scratch him. He didn't know how much stronger he would need to become to defeat that monster. However, there were clues on how to achieve this goal, and he was determined to follow them. At that instant, for a few seconds, he felt he could control a dark power. He focused on learning the sword art of the Holy Swordsman. If he had trained his sword skills more under the same conditions as the Holy Swordsman, the outcome would have been different. For this reason, Kronos had sent him back to the past. Belder's master was irritated to learn that he had attacked a civilian using the techniques she had taught him. Saria, the sword dojo instructor, showed her disappointment with the young man. Belder tried to justify himself, saying it wasn't a fight, but rather a training session. At that moment, Saria struck Belder with her wooden sword to teach him a lesson. She reprimanded him, telling him not to make excuses, as attacking an unarmed person was not a fight training. Pointing the sword at Belder, she told him to leave and never return. She then informed Belder's gang members that none of them could consider themselves students of the dojo anymore. The quartet left dejectedly, and Saria apologized to the protagonist, She had heard that he desired a recommendation for the academy. As a way to apologize for the trouble caused by Belder and his gang, she offered to write the letter of recommendation. However, first she needed to confirm the protagonist's skills, and for that, she handed him a wooden sword. She said he would have the first move in a test fight against her. The protagonist advanced, delivering quick attacks while Saria defended them. Saria noted that the protagonist's Shin sword skills were remarkably practical for his age. Realizing that he had already been through several battles, she had proof of this when he dodged one of her blows. After all, his style was almost entirely self-taught, and his fighting method seemed similar to the Academy's sword style. When he delivered several blows in sequence, Saria wondered if someone had taught him, as he demonstrated exceptional talent. She realized that he was a rough diamond that needed to be polished. After a series of rapid attacks from the protagonist, Saria ended the fight apologizing. She went all out against him, determined to defeat him once and for all and conclude the test. However, the protagonist managed to dodge and defend her blows with remarkable agility. Even under repeated attacks, he kept up with her movements and did not give in to her blows. Saria, who initially only wanted to test his skills, suddenly found herself giving her all in the fight. She wondered why she was so scared of that child. Suddenly, the protagonist delivered a slash imbued with malevolent energy. Saria dodged, feeling a bad premonition, even though the blow seemed rushed. Finally, he revealed his weakness, and Saria intended to end the fight with the next blow. However, the blade of her wooden sword was completely destroyed at that instant. Saria's wooden sword blade flew away, and the protagonist felt the same sensation as before, realizing he still possessed the same power as the time entity. At that moment, he felt intense discomfort and fell to his knees on the ground. His body could not keep up with the power level. He could barely stand, but he claimed to be fine. He thought about not using his power recklessly anymore. He decided not to tell the swordswoman the truth for now. Even if he did, Saria probably wouldn't believe him. Gray, unable to control his power, changed the subject, claiming he had gotten carried away. Saria, however, knew it was impossible to cut a blunt blade in that manner. She was sure that he knew it too, and was lying. Realizing that Gray was avoiding the topic and did not intend to talk about what happened, Saria accepted the situation. Resuming the topic of the academy recommendation, Saria stated that she could provide it. It was the Swordsmanship Academy, the best educational institution in the kingdom. However, she could not recommend him there, as he was not prepared for such an environment. Gray felt that he did not possess enough strength and could barely accomplish anything, except in moments when his power manifested. Instead, Saria suggested he go to the Unified World Academy, not only the best academy in the kingdom, but the most renowned institution in the world. Upon hearing the recommendation for the Unified World Academy, Gray was shocked. After all, it was the place where the holy swordsman and other heroes had emerged. Gray asked if he would be accepted into that academy, and Saria replied that it was impossible. His body was far from being conditioned to be a swordsman. If it were at the Royal Academy, he might still be able to compensate with his skills, but at the Unified World Academy, that would be unfeasible. Saria questioned how he had acquired so much skill with such a fragile body. Gray knew that all the students at that academy were true prodigies, and with his current body, he did not come close to their level. However, Saria encouraged him not to give up, as there were 9 months left until the entrance exam. She admitted that 9 months was not enough time, but she asked him to trust her. Over the next 9 months, she would subject him to rigorous training so that he could enter the academy. Gray, though reluctant to suffer, accepted the challenge. He asked her to train him and guide him in the following months. Saria approved of his response and declared that the torture would begin soon. Days passed, and Gray, in addition to eating abundantly, dedicated himself intensely to training. He honed his sword skills and strengthened his body. 8 months later, Gray had developed a remarkably impressive physique. Saria stated that he was much more muscular and that she had nothing left to teach him. She informed him that in that last month, he would take an exam in an unknown location and should arrive early. She handed him enough money for the trip and for a month's worth of supplies. Gray thought that going a month early for the exam was too soon. He interpreted that as a form of expulsion from the village on her part. Saria, however, said that he was exaggerating. Gray then mentioned the discovery of an ogre nest near the village. He added that there were not many guards, and Saria confirmed the existence of the ogre nests. However, she stated that it did not directly affect them, as help would come from the royal capital. She instructed Gray to go to the exam without worries. Gray soon realized that she was lying, and that no help would reach the village. He knew that, shortly before the village was destroyed, his master would lose her life. In the future, they would say that she had been massacred while facing an ogre alone. Gray thanked Saria and stated that he was leaving for the journey. Saria said that she would pray for him to pass the exam. That very night, Saria headed to the ogre nest in the middle of the forest. She had discovered the nest's location through the scout's report. However, from high up in a tree, Gray asked where his master was going. The master was shocked to see Gray in the tree, questioning his presence since he should have been on his way to the academy. He questioned what she had said about the ogres being exterminated by the royal capital's army. Saria lied, claiming the army couldn't come due to an emergency, which was why she was there alone. Regardless, she stated that she would handle it alone, as she knew the nest's strength from the report. She knew the chief was an elite ogre, and that the nest housed a total of 45 monsters. Even with the difficulties and the presence of an elite ogre, she insisted she would succeed. Gray knew that an elite ogre wasn't that strong in isolation. However, the ogre's true strength lay in its intelligence and leadership. Gray knew that fighting alone would be suicide, as she would be surrounded. He thought that if he left his master alone and departed from the village, she would be destroyed. After all, he had already witnessed this future with his own eyes. Therefore, he insisted that his master take him on this mission. Stubbornly, Saria stated that she would handle the nest alone. However, Gray didn't want to miss the chance to gain combat experience and assured her he wouldn't be a hindrance. Saria could no longer defeat him in training fights, and Gray, obviously, wouldn't be a hindrance in real combat. However, no one knew what could happen in a fight against a newly discovered monster nest. For such a dangerous task, Saria believed it was better to wait until he had more experience. Gray had an idea, since she was so insistent on doing it alone. His idea was to fight Saria until she lost consciousness. Once the master was unconscious, he would deal with the ogre alone. For this, he pointed his sword at the dojo master herself. Faced with this, Saria gave up the idea of going alone, but asked him to make a promise that no matter what happened, he would return alive. The hero lowered his sword and stated that he intended to do exactly that, demanding in return that his master also not die. On that dark night, they set off towards the ogre nest, located in the heart of the mountain. The terrain, which offered no escape routes, gave the ogres great confidence to build their nest there. They knew they couldn't flee, and dealing with intelligent monsters required extreme caution. They did not spot the ogre chief, who was likely inside the main tent. They decided to reduce the number of monsters before the chief emerged from his tent. The master asked Gray to eliminate the visible enemies on one side, while she would take another path to take down the other ogres. With weapons drawn, the two advanced at high speed against the ogres. The ogres barely had time to notice the attack before being struck. Many were eliminated before they could react, until a pack of enraged ogres charged at them. The hero pulled back his sword and delivered a spinning slash, eliminating several enemies at once. One of the ogres tried to deliver an axe blow, but Gray cut it in the belly. Meanwhile, the master swordswoman also eliminated several ogres, without suffering any attacks until that moment. Gray and Saria eliminated all the common ogres in the area. Saria asked Gray if this was his first time in real combat, but he merely asked her to stay alert. Gray found it strange, as the monsters seemed too weak. He knew his master could handle them alone, given the ogre's fragility, unless inside that tent there was a truly horrifying monster. Upon looking at the tent and spotting terrifying red eyes, Gray was startled, ordering his master to leave immediately. Terrified, he yelled for them to get out of that place now. Thus, the two began to run very fast, fleeing the location. However, an elite ogre appeared, destroying part of the camp. Saria commented that it was an honor for the chief himself to come to meet them. However, the protagonist stated that he was not the chief, and that the true one was right behind him. The true chief, an elite ogre, let out a deafening roar. The roar echoed, and the ogres began to react, becoming extremely furious. They noticed that he was something much stronger than just an elite ogre. Gray recognized him as an ogre general, the true chief of the nest. The master recognized that an ogre general was not a monster they could face alone. They decided to eliminate the elite ogre and then leave. Saria defended an axe blow from the elite ogre with her sword. Then she delivered a cut to the ogre's chest. However, the ogre's wound began to heal immediately. The hero explained that the ogre general's roar increased the strength and recovery ability of his allies. That was why the orcs were so strong at that moment. Even the weakest orcs were not easy to defeat. The protagonist left his rear under the protection of the master swordswoman, asking her to buy time, without needing to defeat him. Gray stated that there was only one choice now, to take down the ogre general once and for all. The hero entered into a direct confrontation with the ogre general. He knew it was annoying when they tried to flank him and catch him from behind. At that instant, he had to dodge a blow from another orc that attacked him from behind, focusing on eliminating all enemies in front of him. But At that moment, his sword broke in half. His weapon could not withstand the clash against a strengthened ogre. An attack came his way, and he defended with the hilt of his sword. He realized that the ogre had understood his plan, which was why it was attacking him so brutally. The ogre's high intelligence was not just for show. He grabbed another sword and defended against the axe blows. Then, his master threw another sword in his direction, so that he could use two. Even with two swords, it was not enough to eliminate all enemies. After all, he was facing an ogre general and anyone else who stood in his way. Suddenly, the ogre general roared again, further strengthening his subordinates. He used both swords to defend against more heavy attacks, using his body's strength to push back the ogre's axe. Pushing one of them out of the way, he charged into a crowd of monsters. Attacking in a straight line, he managed to hit several, but suffered an attack to his shoulder. Without time to react, Gray suffered more blows as he advanced. In his attempt to clear a path through the crowd, one of the ogres grabbed him by the waist, immobilizing him, while another monster tried to deliver a fatal blow. The blow was successful, hitting Gray's shoulder. The monsters were wearing down his swords and throwing them at him to immobilize him. At that instant, an enraged monster tried to land a punch on Gray's face. The powerful punch was defended by Gray's sword, but the blade shattered. Gray was thrown backward, severely wounded by the impact of the punch and the previous cuts. He fell to the ground with yet another sword destroyed. He was left with only one sword to face the crowd of monsters. He needed to face hordes of enemies and an ogre general with only one sword. Due to his experience acquired before his regression in time, Gray knew that he would not be able to defeat them. Given this, he ordered his master to flee while the monsters were focused on him. The master laughed, apologized, and stated that she could not do that. Gray said that she should not die there and that she did not need to worry about him. She explained that it was not because of that, saying that she could no longer run as her leg was injured. Due to the cut on her leg, she was out of options and would have to fight. Gray had gone back in time to defeat the liquidator. Everything seemed like it would end the same way. As he delivered another attack, his last sword broke, and he felt hopeless. In denial, he refused to accept that the fight would end that way. If he used the power of the Black Swordsman, he could win. By accessing that power, all his enemies would become weak. So, he decided to recall the feeling he had when facing the liquidator. He closed his eyes, concentrating on that feeling, and looked at the broken sword. When he opened his eyes again, he was enveloped in shadows and delivered an attack with his broken sword, which generated a magical slash. This magical slash was enough to defeat a multitude of ogres lined up in front of him. The master didn't seem to see the blow itself, but noticed that Gray had defeated several monsters. Smiling as shadows consumed his body, he said that everything was fine. He eliminated several orcs at once, leaving the ogre general terrified. Then he delivered a shadowy slash that eliminated the general as well. The master also defended an axe attack. She exclaimed that the monster had given her trouble and cut it into several pieces. Now that the general was no longer strengthening them, the monsters became weak again. Thus, Gray defeated the ogre general using his Black Swordsman form. He apologized for breaking his master's sword. For saving her life, the master said she didn't care about that. She asked about the attack Gray had delivered moments ago. However, she received no answer, as he collapsed to the ground, exhausted. When he became unconscious, she began to shout for him to regain consciousness. After being unconscious, Gray woke up in a dark and unknown place. In front of him, there was a door adorned with iron chains. A black and red energy appeared before him. Immediately, he recognized it as the power he had used before. He wondered if, by opening that door, he would gain the power he so desired. As soon as he took a step forward, he felt the cadaverous presence of a monster behind him. Without knowing why, he felt that if he opened the door at that moment, he would die. This entity said that he had made a good choice by not opening the door at that moment. Then, Gray woke up in a bed, utterly desperate. His master was excited to see him wake up and said that he was in the village infirmary, as he had been unconscious for 5 days. She feared he wouldn't wake up again because the boy had pushed himself so hard that his body collapsed. She said that her words minimized what he had done by defeating all the orcs and the general. Then she asked if his body was all right and if he could move. Gray couldn't gather strength in his right arm, which was completely trembling. He could move it with great effort, but he thought he wouldn't be able to hold swords anymore. Furthermore, there was a shadow-shaped bruise on his forearm. He thought she couldn't see it and stated that he couldn't put strength into his right arm. Saria explained that he had broken all the bones in his right arm and that it would take time to recover. He felt no pain and therefore hadn't realized that the bones in his arm were shattered. answered. She explained that they had treated his arm with a magic potion. Gray was incredulous because magic potions were very expensive. Saria explained that the village chief had gifted Gray the potion. Gray questioned why the village chief would give something so expensive to someone like him. His master then clarified that Gray was now the hero of that village. The news surprised him, but at that moment, the village chief entered the infirmary. He effusively thanked Gray for his heroic act. After all, the ogre general was a monster capable of destroying the village, and no neighboring force would have come to their aid. The chief stated that if Gray hadn't eliminated the threat, the village would have been completely devastated. Therefore, he handed over the potion, in recognition of Gray saving the lives of all the citizens. Gray thought the chief was exaggerating by saying that, without him, the villagers would have died. However, the village chief assured him that there was no exaggeration in his words. Gray knew the chief was right, because, in the world before his regression, the village had indeed been destroyed by the ogres. The chief offered to explain the details, and mentioned that he knew about the academy admission exam Gray wished to take. Gray knew that there were only 2 days left until the academy exams, and that the World Union Academy was a 3-day walk away. He could arrive in 1 day if he went by horse, but he didn't have money for that. So he asked the village chief to lend him a horse. The chief, anticipating the request, had already prepared the best horse in the village in advance. Saria commented that if Gray hadn't woken up on that last day, they would have taken him while he was sleeping. Upon opening the door, Gray saw all the village citizens gathered, holding signs and wishing him good luck. They also thanked him for his heroic act and expressed hope that he would pass the exam. One of the villagers handed Gray a bag, explaining that the entire village had pooled money so he could enroll in the World Union Academy. Very happy, Gray thanked the villagers, promising that he wouldn't be able to return if he failed the exams. Saria added that none of the academy candidates had managed to defeat an ogre general. However, Gray was concerned about the condition of his right arm. Saria reassured him, saying that his left arm was more than enough and that he wouldn't need to use the shadowy power. Gray, however, feared that the exam wouldn't be lenient and would require the use of both arms. Saria, with complete certainty, stated that the academy examiners would notice his skill and that he would pass the test. Gray thanked her. In the other reality, the village had been destroyed, but in this one, it remained standing. This made Gray realize that this world was no longer the same as before. He felt hope that the future could be altered with the power he had acquired. At that moment, he set off on his journey to pass the exam. Thanks to his swift horse, Gray quickly arrived at the city where the exam would take place. Finally, he reached the World Union Academy, a giant castle that stood before him. As soon as he entered the premises, the distribution of exam tickets began. Candidates were instructed to remain in the central arena until the process was complete. Looking around, Gray noticed the large number of candidates and heard comments that only 20 would pass. The candidates commented that the number of successful applicants varied each year. The previous year, 50 people had passed, and there was even a year when only 1 person passed the exams. Over the microphone, the entrance of Professor Ariel was announced. She would begin distributing the exam tickets. Candidates were to pick up the papers in front of them and slide their fingers over them, generating magic. Gray picked up the paper in front of him as instructed. He was candidate number 513 for the fencing course. To the surprise of some, nothing was written on it except the number and the course the person would attempt. The World Union Academy did not discriminate based on age, gender, or social status. Therefore, not even the person's name was written on the paper. After all, these characteristics were not important to the academy. Only those who passed the exam and earned the right to cross the bridge would reveal their names. They could even use false names if they wished, as it would make no difference. Even though he had left his sword at the inn, Gray was assigned to the fencing course. Professor Ariel assigned the courses according to the candidates' appearances, asking those who were in the wrong course to raise their hands. Everyone was surprised that she had chosen the courses based on appearances, speculating whether they had already been previously evaluated or if she had used some kind of mind-reading magic. The professor noted that no one was in the wrong course, and then announced the exam schedules. Gray's exam would be at 11 o'clock on that first day. He wasn't very enthusiastic about having his exam on the very first day, as he wanted more time to recover his arm. He was informed that the exam would be practical, and that delays would result in disqualification, requiring punctuality. Gray could not change the exam time, and furthermore he had no strength in his right arm. He ardently wished for his arm to heal by the next day. The next day, Gray found that his arm had not recovered. Even so, he decided to proceed with the exam. A servant instructed him to wait at the arena entrance, as he would be the next candidate. While his left arm functioned perfectly, his right arm moved only slowly. Gray used the remaining time to observe the examiner, looking to identify any openings in his future opponent. A brute charged at the bespectacled swordsman like a bull, delivering a heavy blow. However, the bespectacled swordsman dodged, and the brute's heavy sword sword hit the ground. The brute declared that he wasn't finished. Pulling his sword from the ground, he prepared a new attack. As he launched his sword at the bespectacled swordsman, the latter defended himself with his thinner blade. The brute was shocked to see that his sword couldn't break his opponent's. At that instant, the brute's guard was broken by the bespectacled swordsman's strength, who delivered a blow, sending the opponent's sword flying and knocking him to the ground. The exam was concluded. The brute could then retrieve his weapon and withdraw. Gray watched the fight, considering it a lost cause. The bespectacled swordsman, who was the examiner, called candidate number 513 to enter the arena. Gray felt hopeless having to face a man who had just defeated a much larger opponent and who had done so using only one arm. The examiner told Gray that he could deliver the first blow. Although Gray didn't feel he had a chance, he decided to give it his all, advancing impetuously against the examiner. Gray remembered his master's teaching, not to swing the sword only with his arms, but to channel the force generated by his entire body through them. Even with his right arm weakened, Gray transferred the force through other muscles, delivering a quick cut that the examiner managed to dodge. It wasn't as if Gray could fight in his usual manner. After all, swinging the sword without full strength wasn't as simple as in training. While his left arm prepared another sword strike, the examiner tried to take advantage of the opening. However, the instructor's sword seemed too slow for Gray. Gray managed to predict the trajectory of the blow and defended it with ease. He realized that the instructor possessed considerable power, but his speed didn't compare to his master's. Trusting in the swordsmanship he had learned from her, Gray believed he could compensate for the difference in strength in his arms. Gray attacked from the front and then advanced against the examiner at high speed. Gray noticed the examiner's slowness, who began to show shock. Gray had overestimated the man, realizing that he was not as strong as he seemed. He remembered his master's words, who had stated that he would certainly win the test. They engaged in a sword clash, and Gray managed to deflect the examiner's arm upwards. Gray felt confident that he would truly win the test. Although Gray understood the examiner's swordsmanship, the power difference was significant, and he couldn't break the opponent's stance. After all, it wasn't that easy to win using only one hand. With this in mind, Gray observed that the examiner's movements were becoming disorganized. Gray dodged a blow from the examiner and planned a way to end the fight. He remained still, waiting for the examiner to deliver an attack. When the instructor delivered a top-to-bottom sword strike, Gray noticed a wide and open blow. As he dodged to the side, Gray exposed an opening. The strike, large and predictable, left an opening in the instructor's back. It didn't matter how great the power difference between them was. Having reached the examiner's back, Gray had a surprise attack ready to be unleashed. The moment Gray was preparing to deliver the sword strike to the examiner's back, the fight was interrupted. Gray found it a bit early to stop the fight. It was announced that the exam's time limit had come to an end. For this reason, the exam result was a draw. Gray was sad that he hadn't achieved victory, even though he had prepared the final attack. Looking down, Gray felt that he had given his best, but knew that things would be difficult for him since he hadn't managed to defeat the instructor. Deciding to try the exam again the following year, with his arm healed, Gray looked at the Grand Colosseum and thanked for the opportunity. A week later, a meeting was held at the World Union Academy. An elderly man asked for the attendees' opinions on the candidates now that the exams had finished. The meeting participants agreed that the joint observation method was quite efficient. Another member added that they couldn't afford to ignore a talent just to facilitate the process. The elderly man reiterated that he didn't want opinions on the exam system, but rather on the students. Starting with the swordsmanship course, they asked who had passed the exam. All who defeated the examiner were approved. The others were evaluated based on the quality they demonstrated. Besides the winners, 3 other candidates stood out. It was argued that even if others were admitted, they wouldn't be able to keep up with the classes, and the focus should be on the most prominent candidates. As no one raised objections, the approved candidates for the swordsmanship course were confirmed, until one of the attendees asked about candidate number 513. Professor Ariel, with red hair, inquired about this candidate. The evaluators opened the protagonist's fighting video and smiled. They were certain that the young man would win. However, the need for traps to defeat the instructor raised doubts about his admission to the academy. Furthermore, they commented that although he possessed technique, he lacked strength, and they felt he was outmatched from the beginning to the end of the combat. Thus, they discarded the possibility of candidate number 513 being admitted. Ariel considered it a waste that, even watching the exam together, they hadn't noticed something important. The next day, all candidates gathered in front of the clock tower. The protagonist observed his application form, awaiting the result. At that moment, the names of the approved candidates for the swordsmanship course were announced. 6 candidates were approved. 5 names were read at once, and none of them belonged to the protagonist. Then, all 6 candidates were announced, and the protagonist was not among those approved. The approved candidates were supposed to cross the bridge and complete their enrollment by the end of the day. Meanwhile, the forms of the unapproved candidates began to burn. The protagonist realized that he truly had not been approved for the exam, until suddenly, the Divine Eye special admission was announced, and candidate number 513, Gray, was approved. The application form in his hands burned in a blue flame. Gray had been approved through the Divine Eye special admission, something the protagonist was hearing about for the first time. Some commoners commented that the World Union Academy was weak, allowing people to enter through questionable means. Gray had no connections, so he thought his master might have helped him. An old man reprimanded the commoners, asking them not to speak that way about the special admission. After all, the Divine Eye was an honored category, responsible for training heroes for over 100 years. Recent candidates approved by the Divine Eye included Amy White, Bella Albright, and Leek Muller, in addition to the great Jacob Bloomfield, who would become a hero in the future. The candidates present considered these swordsmen very unsuccessful. The protagonist recognized that these were the 3 who had been part of the main force against the Liquidator. And, in that new reality, his name would be alongside theirs. The entrance ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. It was said that they could change and gather in the square in front of the building. The protagonist was seen in uniform, sporting the Academy's insignia. Upon arriving at the square in front of the building, the students wondered if that was the correct location. At that moment, a man informed them that there had been a slight delay in preparation due to a mistake. He asked them to take a few steps back while he positioned the stairs. After positioning them, he invoked magic and used it on the structure. The structure began to break apart, and an intense light started to emanate. The students were shocked to see the amount of magic that was being emanated. At that instant, the main building appeared before them, emerging from the ground. The instructors said that they could sit wherever they wanted. The students gathered, understanding that a teleportation magic had moved the building. The protagonist thought that they wanted to hold the entrance ceremony in a place from which the school building could be seen, realizing that this was the power of the World Union Academy, capable of moving an entire structure with a teleportation spell. He found the ratio of 600 candidates to only 30 accepted students exaggerated. The man said that he had never studied much besides sword handling. After all, a friend had questioned his intelligence. She began to explain that the academy, as the name suggested, gathered the best students from all over the world. At that moment, students from all over the world began to arrive, transported by balloons and dragons descending from the sky. A magical airship called Strato Queen appeared. The protagonist had already boarded it once when he was part of the Liquidator subjugation squads. It was said that it was one of the largest airships in the world, and that it was being used only because of the ceremony. This made him understand the absurd level that the World Union Academy possessed. Many students from other schools arrived at that moment. Thus, the man with glasses began the entrance ceremony. They thanked the director for his speech, which lasted a considerable time. Even the Academy's entrance ceremony wasn't that different from a normal one, and the protagonist felt sleepy. After the greetings from the best students of each course, the presentation would begin. The director asked Leonhardt, the best student of the swordsmanship course, to step forward. They began to whisper about him, who had defeated the examiner at the moment of the admission exam. Rumors said that he was as good as any of the professors in swordsmanship. His name was Leonhard Apis. He confirmed if he could speak freely in the course and thanked them when they accepted the proposal. Therefore, he decided to make a statement to the World Union Academy. Leonhard addressed his peers, stating that although not all of them had been admitted through conventional means, it was an honor to join the academy alongside each of them. To become individuals who contribute to the world, it was essential that they work together. He expressed his anticipation for the days when, as prestigious students, they could aim for great achievements. However, Leonhardt declared that amidst all of this, there was something that did not deserve to be present. He was referring to Professor Ariel and the Divine Eye, which had admitted the protagonist. Professor Ariel spoke up, stating that all students had passed a rigorous examination. She added that even if there was disagreement with Leonhardt, she did not consider it a good idea to exclude students. Leonhardt replied that he was not referring to those who were admitted through the normal examination. He was talking about a student whom Professor Ariel had irregularly placed in the academy, a student admitted through the Divine Eye's special admission. Leonhardt demanded that this student reveal their identity, return their uniform, and leave the academy immediately. The protagonist did not understand the reason for Leonhardt's hostility. He felt relieved that Leonhardt did not recognize his face and decided not to speak up. Professor Ariel commented that the students that year were quite lively. Leonhardt, serious, insisted that they stop admitting students irregularly. Professor Ariel approached Leonhardt and threatened him, saying that he was no stronger than the protagonist. Leonhardt was stunned by the professor's sinister approach. She then liked Leonhardt's attitude and decided to propose a bet, putting her own job and the protagonist's admission on the line. Leonhardt asked if Professor Ariel wanted him to fight the special admissions student. Ariel replied that she would not do that, as Leonhardt could end up lifeless if the protagonist fought with all his strength. As an educator, she could not put her students' lives at risk. Leonhardt became very annoyed with Professor Ariel's proposal. However, she stated that she was serious and that the bet instead would involve monsters. She knew that Leonhardt was more skilled at fighting monsters than humans. The bet was simple. They would only have to eliminate one monster that she would choose as the target. Each round would present stronger monsters. Whoever did not defeat the monster first would lose. If the special admission student lost, Ariel would be retired from her position as a professor. On the other hand, if Leonhardt lost, he would have to do anything she commanded. Before accepting, Leonhardt wanted to know what the target monsters for the test would be. Even confident, he knew that he should still consider the risk. Ariel, then, preferred to develop a different proposal. The first target she proposed was an ogre general. As soon as she mentioned this, Leonhardt, indignant, slammed his hand on the table and declared that this was not a monster he could face alone. Professor Ariel explained that she was asking him to defeat this monster, but that the deadline could be extended for an entire year. Leonhardt replied that if it were possible to defeat such a monster with only 1 year of training, people would not suffer so much because of it. He asked her to choose another monster for the test, reiterating his understanding that if a monster of that level could be defeated with 1 year of training, humanity would not face so many problems. Professor Ariel presented another condition. In case of a tie, Leonhardt would win the bet. If the protagonist failed to defeat the ogre general, she would be fired and the special admission student expelled. When asked what he thought of this, Leonhardt replied that it was madness. Professor Ariel concluded that he had no options and accepted the bet. But Leonhardt added that the ogre general could not be the final challenge and claimed that he could sign the contract without problems at that moment. Leonhardt took the pen and signed the magical contract without hesitation. He asked the professor if the student could really win, raising some points of questioning. The other students thought it was madness for Ariel to bet her career on a boy. Some believed that she had already passed her prime, was not very strong, and would not leave the academy. The protagonist was not very happy with the bet. He thought the professor had given a 1-year deadline to defeat the ogre because of him. He imagined she had observed him before his enrollment. He was shocked to observe every demand she had made from the beginning, realizing that his professor was truly playing dirty with those conditions. After some time, a class on the fundamentals of magic began. The professor assumed the students were surprised by him giving a lecture on the very first day. However, he stated that in that academy, no day would be wasted, starting with the most basic, how to use magic. He explained that an invisible energy called ether exists in the human body. By manipulating ether through the body's magical circuits, it is possible to use magic. The professor feared that it might not be necessary to explain these fundamentals if the students already mastered magic. With the class's initial theoretical questions and explanations concluded, Gray realized his problem now was ending up in the same class as Leonhardt. He ardently hoped that Leonhardt would not discover his status as a special admission student, the Divine Eye. The professor called Gray's attention, observing that he was looking away and losing focus. Gray apologized, surprised that the professor had noticed him so quickly, even though he was in the back row of the classroom. The professor declared that if the students were so confident, they should demonstrate their power to everyone. He was sure that the students already mastered basic magic. Although they were in the swordsmanship course, the professor knew there was no problem with not using magic frequently. However, the professor emphasized that even for swordsmen, it was essential to know the basics of magic to coordinate with mages. Gray realized that the professor's explanation was identical to what he had received in the training camp. He assumed that the magic to be practiced would be the same he had already seen. Gray wondered if the magic they would learn would be the ether projectile. The professor noticed that Gray already seemed familiar and asked if he could use magic. Gray confirmed that he could, having learned it in the training camp. Seizing the opportunity, the professor decided to turn the demonstration into a duel. Leonhardt also knew how to use ether projectiles, and the professor proposed that the two face each other. Leonhardt stated that he had also been trained in magic before joining the academy. The professor explained that, although there was a power difference between the two, an ether projectile would not be lethal. Then, he revealed that Gray was that year's Divine Eye student. At that moment, the entire class turned their eyes to Gray. Gray was annoyed with the professor for exposing his secret identity. He stood up, determined to show everyone how he used magic. Meanwhile, Leonhardt decided to show the other students the true nature of the academy. The professor instructed the special student, Gray, to come down and approach. When the professor gave the signal, the two would fire ether projectiles at each other. Gray didn't feel confident, as he had only trained this technique for a few days on the battlefield. He feared he wouldn't emerge unscathed. The professor then gave the signal for them to begin the training. Leonhardt formed a magic projectile, determined to demonstrate the incredible difference in strength between them. Gray also created an ether magic to retaliate. The two launched their magic simultaneously, and they canceled each other out. The two magic spheres collided. However, Gray's sphere overpowered his rivals, advancing towards Leonhardt, who was visibly startled. But the professor intervened, conjuring a magic shield that saved the student. However, the professor's shield also shattered, and the magic resulted in an explosion. All the students felt the impact of the explosion, including Leonhardt. The professor rushed to Leonhardt to check if the boy had been injured. Leonhardt was fine, but the professor knew he could have died if the barrier hadn't attenuated the magic. The students asked how Gray had achieved such a feat. Gray, in fact, thought the spell he had cast was very weak. He questioned if the ether projectile he had learned in the subjugation squad was different. Gray asked if the others had also done something similar. The professor explained that Gray had achieved that because the quality of his projectile was different. He warned that it wasn't normal ether, but rather super compressed ether. No one in the room had ever heard of super compressed ether. It was a power that even the professors had difficulty producing, and Gray had done it perfectly. The professor stated that it was the first time he had seen such a powerful ether projectile, something no one in the academy could replicate. People began to agree that the Divine Eye's admission was correct in accepting him. Meanwhile, Gray thought something was wrong. He said that all the spells learned by the squad in the training field were like that. Gray asked if they were mocking him, as he believed anyone should be able to do something like that with practice. The professor chuckled and asked Gray to transfer to the magic course, offering a personal recommendation. However, Gray refused the proposal to transfer to the magic course. The professor considered that Gray had performed ether compression, producing super compressed ether, and at such a young age. He stated that Gray was an unparalleled prodigy, even by the Academy's standards. He said that the person who had claimed Gray had no talent knew nothing. The room found it strange that the professor, who rarely gave praise, spoke so much to a student. The professor declared that it would be a crime and a loss to the world of magic if Gray didn't study it. Gray remembered hearing about the ether compression technique. In ancient times, the true nature of compressed ether, known today as life force, was unknown. The person who taught him about the subject explained that casting magic effectively was extremely difficult, as it required compressing ether within one's own body before releasing it. In the future, this technique would be viewed with disdain, considered weak and ineffective. Gray then asked the professor if he knew about OD. From the master's reaction, Gray understood that the world of that era still had no knowledge of OD. This meant that what he had learned in the subjugation squad was, in fact, knowledge from the future. He would need to be extremely cautious when deciding with whom to share this information. Gray declared his deep love for swords and refused the offer to join the magic course. The professor, respecting his decision, told him he could seek him out any time if he changed his mind. Upon returning to his seat, the professor stated that he would no longer reprimand him if he looked away during class. He added that the lecture was too basic for Gray, who was free to leave at any time. The other students were incredulous at the permission, and Leonhardt in particular changed his attitude towards Gray. Later, Professor Ariel sent a letter to Gray, requesting his presence in her office after class. Gray assumed the summons was the result of a complaint from Professor Carlos from the fencing course, and that Professor Ariel would likely advise him to change courses. Upon entering the room, Gray was surprised by an attack. Someone lunged at him with a sword, but he easily defended the blow. His body reacted instinctively to the attack from a blue-haired girl. He realized he had seen that girl somewhere before. At that moment, Ariel confirmed that her observations about Gray were correct. She also stated that Bella had not held back, and that Gray's movements were impeccable. Gray confirmed that the attacker was Bella Albright, the sorceress. Ariel declared that the other professors should resign from their positions, as they were unable to perceive whether Bella had held back or not. The professors admitted their failure and handed coins to Professor Ariel. Ariel explained that they were betting on whether Gray could defend Bella's surprise attack. She then handed a gold coin to Gray, as she had won the bet. The professors noticed that Gray did not use his dominant arm for defense, as if he were protecting an immobile arm due to an injury. They speculated that the injury was deeper than it appeared. Gray was surprised by the professor's ability to deduce all of that just by observing him. Ariel added that if they weren't capable of such perception, they wouldn't be professors at the World Union Academy. Ariel revealed that she had known about Gray's condition since the admission exam, which was why she had made the bet, and then dismissed them. The professors, while admitting Gray's potential, warned that if the injury didn't heal, he would have to leave the academy. As soon as the other professors left the room, Ariel wanted to discuss magic. She had received information information that Gray used compressed ether in Professor Carlos's class. Professor Carlos himself had sought out Ariel's office to transfer Gray to the magic course. However, Ariel refused, as she believed Gray was more suited to wielding a sword than using magic. She was sure that he wasn't just good at compressing ether. Seeing that Ariel perceived everything with just a glance, Gray decided not to lie. She wanted to know what trick he had used and promised not to tell anyone, even offering a reward. Ariel revealed that her interest was because of Bella Albright. Gray almost called her a sorceress, which could cause a problem. Ariel explained that Bella was brilliant in magical theory, but not in practice. For some reason, she couldn't compress ether effectively. Gray had already heard that Bella was deficient in this aspect and now understood why. When using super compressed ether, he didn't do it the conventional way. There was a way to use super compressed ether without actually performing the compression. Consequently, Bella wouldn't need to be sent to Professor Bradley. Gray was shocked to realize it was Professor Varian Bradley. It was impossible not to know him, as Varian Bradley was infamous in the magical world. He had conducted countless experiments on humans, resulting in murders. In the future, he would cause numerous magical disasters, leading to the deaths of thousands of people. Being the worst magical criminal in history, he had not yet been captured. Ariel explained that if Bella couldn't create super compressed ether by the end of the year, she would be sent to Bradley for surgery. Gray was shocked, finding the idea bizarre. The surgery, under the pretext of enhancing magical abilities, was actually a human experiment. Although it wasn't yet public knowledge, Ariel knew that some people had already died because of Bradley. Bella found the prospect terrifying, but she would be expelled from the academy by the end of the year if she couldn't use super compressed ether. Professor Ariel preferred Bella Albright to leave the academy rather than have her body altered by such a procedure. This was knowledge that didn't exist at that time. For this reason, Gray feared revealing his knowledge and altering the course of history. He remembered humanity's annihilation before the Liquidator. Gray preferred to change that hellish future rather than allow events to follow their natural course. Thus, he decided to teach Bella Albright how to use super compressed ether. Together, they went to the arena, where Gray shared all his knowledge about magic. There, they signed a magical contract that prevented them from revealing what Gray was teaching. Gray then asked Bella and Professor Ariel for their opinions on what he had just taught. Professor Ariel was impressed by the level and depth of the knowledge Gray revealed. Bella, in turn, found the explanation concise but extremely well organized. It was as if she were attending a magic class from hundreds of years in the future. In her view, Gray's explanation advanced the history of magic by 100 years. In fact, all of Gray's knowledge came from a lecture that Bella Albright herself had given 10 years in the future. However, he did not reveal this information. There was a lot of information that Professor Ariel could not accurately judge to determine its veracity. Bella Albright, however, believed there was a high chance it was true, as nothing contradicted current magical theory. Furthermore, the quickest way to discover the truth was by testing it, which was why they were there. If everything Gray had said was true, the spell would work. Bella then used her current power, invoking magic through her staff. Gray recalled that it was said Bella's full power was capable of setting an entire city ablaze. Moreover, it was rumored that she couldn't properly control her magical output. When Bella conjured the magic, an intense glow emanated, followed by an explosion. The explosion was so powerful that it made Gray scream. He was in the crossfire, surrounded by the tower of fire Bella had created. The power was overwhelming, and if Bella hadn't taken control of the magic, Gray would have perished. The fire began to climb Gray's arm but stopped, and Bella saved his life. Bella was happy to have finally managed to control the ether in the way Gray had taught. At that moment, an enormous fire dragon emerged from her staff, and Bella found the scene amusing. However, Bella's ether was completely depleted, and she fell to the ground unconscious. Professor Ariel explained that Bella fainted because her magic source was depleted. Professor Ariel found it wonderful to think that Bella had conjured such a powerful magic in so little time. Still unconscious, Bella replied that the super compressed ether theory was incredible, not her. However, the theory did not belong to Gray, but to herself, created in the future, in a different timeline. Professor Ariel stated that now that Bella could create super compressed ether, she no longer needed the surgery. Professor Ariel was happy that they had avoided that risky surgery with Bradley, and that Bella had not lost control of her magic. Professor Ariel explained that the surgery increased magical output, but at the cost of control over it. Its exact functioning was a secret, but it seemed to be a surgery that broke the strength of a person's limiter. It was because of this surgery that sorceresses in the ancient world could not control their powerful magic. In any case, thanks to Gray, Bella could now create super compressed ether and fulfill the terms of the contract. It was now Professor Ariel's turn to fulfill the parts of her own contract. Thus, Professor Ariel would use magic on Gray's arm to heal the magical wound. She conjured a spell, and several butterflies began to float towards Gray's arm. In moments, Gray's right arm returned to functioning and moving normally. Gray thanked Professor Ariel, as not even healing potions had managed to restore his arm. Professor Ariel asked that her nerve restoration magic not be compared to common potions. She asked Gray to swing his sword to check if his arm was moving as before. Gray drew his sword from its sheath, and the movement seemed normal. He performed some hyper-fast movements, but said that his arm was not moving as well as before. Even repairing the nerves, the magic could not heal the wounds on Gray's soul. Professor Ariel said that the magical knowledge of that era had not proven the existence of a soul, yet she believed it existed. After all, she could see souls with her secret eye, noticing that Gray's soul was healing gradually and naturally, as long as he didn't exert himself too much. Gray thought about avoiding sword practice to heal, but Professor Ariel said he should train normally. She wanted to know what kind of swordsmanship could wound a soul in that way. Furthermore, there was an example of swordsmanship that used the soul to move swords. Professor Ariel asked if Gray knew the girl Amy White. This was the sword saint who, at that time, was not even known yet. After all, the way Gray wielded the sword seemed to indicate that he had learned from Amy. There is, however, a subtle difference. The person who taught him swordsmanship is slightly more skilled than Amy. He understands that Amy, in the future, will reach the same level of mastery as his mentor. Gray claims to have learned his swordsmanship in a dojo in his hometown. Then, he changes the subject, questioning whether it is truly possible for someone's soul to be damaged through swordsmanship. Ariel replies that by no means could such damage be caused by common swordsmanship. She then asks if Gray used the mysterious power residing within him. Gray realizes that the professor can see through her shining eye. She is able to see his power leaking through the chain door. Gray recalls the chain door he had seen previously. He understands that Ariel truly saw this manifestation, as it wouldn't be possible to deduce something like that. Ariel reveals that she has witnessed an aura similar to his before. Gray asks if there are other mages with similar powers. She confirms that there are, although she doesn't know if they are human or not. She informs him that they are known as liquidators. Observing Gray's reaction, Ariel is certain that he has heard of them. Gray did not expect that name to be mentioned at this time. Ariel, in turn, did not expect the concept of the liquidator to be already known. She is not surprised, as the student brought knowledge from the future with him. Gray understands that it is knowledge from the future, something no one else knows yet. She asks how much he understands about the liquidator. Gray replies that he knows the liquidator represents an extremely dangerous threat to humanity. It must be stopped before its manifestation and destroyed at all costs. Ariel agrees about the danger and reveals that Bradley is determined to proceed with his experiments. Gray asks what Bradley's connection to the liquidator is. The professor explains that the liquidator is the very entity Bradley is trying to summon. Gray is shocked because it was never revealed to him that the liquidator had been created by man. In the other timeline, the Academy acted as if it knew exactly where the liquidator would appear. He understands that the Academy had been involved in summoning the liquidator all along. Gray wishes to stop this experiment immediately. Ariel explains that since one of those involved in the project is a professor of her same rank, she does not have the authority to stop the experiment. Gray asks who the superiors are whom she tried to warn about canceling the experiment. However, she is not authorized to reveal to him who these superiors are. Unless the order comes from a higher authority, no one can force the interruption of this experiment. Gray understands that the Academy's leadership is much more inaccessible than he had imagined. However, the fact that Balian Bradley is a criminal should change the situation. In the previous world, the insane professor's illegal experiments resulted in the deaths of dozens of women. Gray knows exactly where he conducted the fatal experiments. He knows where Bradley is conducting the illegal experiment and tells Ariel to catch him red-handed. However, the professor explains that this will not work because breaking into the research room would be a crime. Without concrete evidence, they would both end up arrested. She asks if Gray has proof of Bradley's crimes. If not, they will have to shelve this idea for now. Even knowing Bradley is dangerous, their hands are tied. Then, the professor decides to address Gray's power and asks if he wishes to learn to control it. She mentions that there is a professor at the Academy very competent in dealing with unknown forces. His name is Heathcote Longfellow. Gray knows that Heathcote is the same one who trained the Sword Saint herself. Ariel will arrange for him to begin private training with this professor the next day. The reason he came to this academy is precisely to master this power, and he thanks the professor. Gray did not expect to find a clue on how to do this so quickly. The next day, he meets the professor and starts running. He wonders why he is running if he should be receiving private lessons from Longfellow. The professor observes that Gray's mind is wandering as they run through the forest. He tells him to pick up the pace since he is thinking so much, and to run until his body reaches its limit. Only after burning every drop of physical strength will his soul awaken. Longfellow states that as long as Gray still has energy in his body, they will not touch a sword. Gray imagines that Longfellow's training must have a reason. However, while running, he thinks about the experiments Bailey and Bradley is conducting. He wonders if he should really be doing this now, while a criminal is at large. A week later, Ariel asks how the training with Longfellow is going. Gray explains that they only did running and a very short sword training at the end. When Gray mentioned feeling stronger, Ariel commented that that type of training was typical of Longfellow. Suddenly, the butler interrupted them to deliver a letter to Professor Ariel. Upon reading the letter, Professor Ariel assumed a grim expression. The correspondence was a report detailing that Bella Albright was producing super-compressed ether. The report indicated that although Bella had acquired a very similar power, subsequent examinations revealed that she did not actually compress it. Consequently, her new ability could not be officially recognized as super-compressed ether. Bailey and Bradley stated in the letter that the contract would remain valid and the operation would proceed as planned. Gray considered Bailey and Bradley's letter complete insanity. Professor Ariel realized that Bailey and Bradley was determined to force Bella Albright to undergo the surgery. The contract was loophole-proof, making it difficult for the girl to refuse the surgery. The only way to change this situation would be if Bailey and Bradley himself annulled the contract, or if Bella Albright were expelled, or the operation was cancelled. Ariel then asked for Gray's help to accomplish this mission. She demanded that Gray reveal the location of Bailey and Bradley's laboratory so they could expose him as a criminal. Gray scoffed, reminding her of her own words about the danger of going there without proof. Ariel, however, placed her faith in Gray and declared herself willing to find evidence to incriminate Bailey and Bradley. She assumed she had already done so from the start by trusting Gray. After all, her divine eye had already confirmed that Gray was telling the truth the entire time. Ariel asked Gray to show the way, stating that together they would bring Bailey and Bradley's crimes to light. Gray commented that Bailey and Bradley's laboratory was near Torowell Village. Ariel recalled that Torowell Mountain housed a laboratory authorized by the Academy. Gray understood that Bailey and Bradley was conducting illegal experiments in a laboratory that was paradoxically authorized. Professor Ariel questioned what place would be more suitable for illegal experiments than that one. After all, no one would suspect, as Bailey and Bradley spent a lot of time there. Furthermore, no Academy professor interfered with another colleague's laboratory. Ariel concluded that as long as they obtained proof of Bailey and Bradley's crimes, they would not be accused of invading the laboratory. Suddenly, Bella Albright knocked on the door and entered, informing Professor Ariel that she had also received a letter from Bailey and Bradley. Ariel took the letter from Bella's hand and stated that she would handle that situation for her student. Bella Albright asked if Ariel was planning to confront Bailey and Bradley because of her. Professor Ariel replied that she was self-sufficient to deal with the situation. Gray interrupted, stating that he could also help. Since the problem was hers, Bella Albright also expressed a desire to help. Ariel expressed her fear that the insane professor, who conducted human experiments, might capture one of them, as no one knew what Bailey and Bradley was capable of. Gray argued that this was precisely why it would be dangerous for Ariel to go alone. Gray stated that he could use the same power he employed to take down General Ogro, and thus assist in the mission. Furthermore, Bella Albright, as a special admissions student, asked Ariel to let them decide their own destinies. Professor Ariel realized that even if she tried to stop them, Gray and Bella would go after Bailey and Bradley. In that case, she would let them go, but with one condition. No matter what happened, they should prioritize their own safety above all else. The two students agreed. They arrived in the mountains and found Bailey and Bradley's hidden laboratory. Bella Albright could hardly believe that Bailey and Bradley was actually conducting illegal experiments in that location. Professor Ariel was certain and stated that they would look for the evidence at that moment. Gray was also certain that this was the place. Bella Albright, trusting both of them, asked if they would be able to collect the evidence without problems. Ariel explained that Bailey and Bradley should be at the Society of Magic conference at that moment. There was a high chance the main entrance would be full of traps, so they should enter through the side. Invading a laboratory authorized by the Academy was a crime, but at that moment, it was a necessity. When Professor Ariel suggested that Bella could go back if she was uncomfortable, Bella Albright remained firm in the mission. Ariel told Bella Albright that she was mistaken to think they were doing all of that just because of her. Gray also stated that stopping those experiments was for a greater good for the world. After all, if they didn't act, countless people would be sacrificed. Ariel considered that it might be an exaggeration, but she agreed that the experiments needed to be stopped. They were not risking their lives solely because of Bella Albright. Then they advanced at high speed and cast spells against Bali and Bradley's laboratory. They caused a considerable explosion at the laboratory doors to deactivate the traps. They blew a hole in the wall and were met with a shocking scene. Several people were trapped in cells, visibly starving. Ariel commented that they wouldn't even need to exert themselves to find proof of Bailey and Bradley's crimes. A quick glance was enough to identify 14 forbidden spells, which alone constituted a serious crime. Furthermore, the unauthorized human experiments represented a most grievous offense. In the center of the hall, an altar is set up, filled with candles and a magical symbol. The group's plan is to leave with the evidence, and they ponder whether they should rescue the imprisoned people immediately. The hero states that they cannot delay, as Bali and Bradley might return at any moment. At that instant, Bailey and Bradley unexpectedly emerges from the shadows, surprising them. Ariel asks what happened at the conference. Bailey and Bradley states that he sent a double in his place, as he had a crucial experiment to conduct in that laboratory. He mentions that he obtained fresh materials for the experiment. His intention is to use them while they are still fresh. However, his plans changed upon spotting 3 intruders in his isolated laboratory. He already desired materials with greater magical potential than ordinary people. He also doesn't understand how they discovered his experiments. However, he is certain that no one else knows of their presence there. If all of them suddenly disappeared, no one would suspect Bailey and Bradley. He plans to use the group as test subjects, and their sacrifice would advance the limits of magic. Since he cannot let them leave alive, he will ensure they are put to good use. Suddenly, powerful magic is cast against him. Bella Albright conjures magic from her staff that explodes in the area. Bailey and Bradley shields himself and comments that the spell was magnificent. He states that Ariel's divine eye still possesses great skill. He assumes that the special admission student has exceptional talent. He wishes to start closely observing the divine eye recruits. He is not impressed by such a small trick, but rather by an academy student attempting to assassinate her professor. She lost her chance, and the situation is better than being eliminated by him. Ariel orders them to retreat for now, as they have already collected the evidence and the academy can handle the rest. Bailey and Bradley conjures dark magic, not wanting to let them leave there alive. He casts his dark magic, which Ariel defends with a magical barrier. Bella Albright thanks the professor, as she thought she would be hit by the attack. Bailey and Bradley says that the devouring flame is the result of his research. It produces a fire that consumes defensive magic, burning it as fuel and making its own magic more powerful. Although it requires a rare material to be conjured, it is invincible. Professor Ariel tries her best to defend, however, the task is complex. Her barrier develops a crack, and the devouring flame begins to penetrate. Ariel asks Bella Albright to take the spell memory bag to Gray. After all, if Heathcote sees it, he will know what to do with the bag. When the barrier is about to break, Bella Albright adds defensive magic. Professor Ariel tells Bella Albright to get out of there and stop helping. Bella Albright notices the professor's barrier breaking and asks her to leave the rest to her. Professor Ariel remembers the promise they made to prioritize their lives. She comments that Bailey and Bradley's magic is abnormal and that common defensive spells will not work. Suddenly, Ariel's barrier completely breaks, and she says she will buy time. Bella Albright uses another defensive magic and says that everything is under control. She states that she only needed a different type of defensive magic for his spell, which is not that potent. However, the anti-magic theory of the devouring flame is known only by mages like Bailey and Bradley. Bella Albright says that someone recently taught her a new theory. Bailey and Bradley begins to ask the name of the traitor who taught the anti-spell and is overcome by intense hatred. He states that if she reveals the traitor's name, he will eliminate her quickly. Bella Albright solemnly replies that it is a secret. However, she confirms that the traitor is a student from the fencing course and remembers the protagonist's lessons, with the protagonist having set up most of these lessons. Realizing that she will not answer seriously, Bali and Bradley picks up a crystal and says he will burn them alive. The moment he breaks the crystal, tormented souls begin to advance towards the group of heroes. The souls seek to devour them and transform into living flames. They merge into a single entity, which becomes an enormous, gigantic, and massive black flame. The hero asks if Bella Albright is okay, and she replies that the barrier will hold. However, her mana reserve is about to run out. Bella Albright asks the hero to attack Bailey and Bradley, as she is busy maintaining the defense. Professor Ariel activates the Divine Eye to attack Bailey and Bradley. She notices a point where the flames are weaker and decides to project her magic outside the barrier. Thus, she projects her mana outside Bella Albright's barrier and launches it towards Bailey and Bradley's weakened point. Powerful electric bolts launched towards the villain. Bailey and Bradley noticed Ariel's counterattack attempt. However, the bolts could not reach him. him. Gray recalled that Professor Ariel's offensive magic was the weakest among the faculty. Due to the properties of Bailey and Bradley's flame, he must have been absorbing Ariel's spells. Bella Albright, almost out of mana, visibly staggered. It was for this reason that Professor Ariel, the one with the divine eye, had insisted they flee earlier. Gray stated that it was preferable for this to happen than for all three of them to die. Gray said that he had insisted on confronting Bailey and Bradley from the start and did not blame Ariel. Ariel advised him not to use that power for now. Otherwise, the damage could be irreversible. Upon hearing this, the protagonist swallowed hard and affirmed that he understood. Bella Albright said she felt no ether and asked if what they saw was magic. She knew that trying to explain a power of that magnitude merely as magic was impossible. Ariel preferred that Bella Albright not investigate the matter further, nor speak about what she witnessed there. Professor Ariel warned that if Bella Albright did not promise, she would have to erase her memories. Bella Albright affirmed that she understood and asked if they should make another magical contract. Professor Ariel agreed, and the contract appeared before the two of them. They signed the contract. The protagonist, concerned about the experiments, said they should help people. He noticed that the experiment victims had only been put to sleep by magic. Even though they weren't in imminent danger, the test subjects should be taken to the Academy's medical facilities. So, Ariel created several cocoons of glowing magic to protect them from external harm. With that resolved, they decided to investigate the mountain laboratory further. The illegal experiments occurring there, as far as they could see, involved human sacrifices. These sacrifices served to produce magical catalysts or enhance human abilities. Ariel found no experiments related to the liquidator and wondered if it was in another facility. Gray found it strange, as that was the site of an incident that claimed the lives of tens of thousands of people. He wondered how the mere production of a magical catalyst could have caused such a disaster. Then, Gray understood that what eliminated the people in his past world was the miasma that erupted from underground. He froze, immersed in this possibility, and the two girls noticed his dread. The protagonist realized that there was certainly something beneath that laboratory. He told the two girls that there might be hidden passages underground. They found no hidden passages, but Ariel noticed something with her divine eye. Ariel activated her ocular ability and detected traces of short-distance teleportation magic. She figured it was a space accessible only by teleportation, located about 300 meters underground. Gray asked if they could reach it, and Ariel replied that she would use a short-distance teleportation portal as well. They tried, and Ariel activated a short-distance teleportation magic circle. Ariel explained that if there was nothing on the other side of the portal, they would land on solid ground. Suddenly, the portal opened, revealing several strange structures. They hadn't imagined such a vast space existed beneath the facility. Ariel felt an enormous amount of ether coming from all directions, until she noticed a main structure in the center of that place. This structure didn't just emanate ether, but also an energy different from magic. It was the most powerful magic Ariel had ever witnessed, and the protagonist understood it was the liquidator's power. They approached the large central structure. Upon entering, they saw a door with a strange symbol. The door was surrounded by a pentagram with candles, and power emanated from that room. However, there were no signs of the liquidator there, and Professor Ariel knocked on the door. Bella Albright asked if it was safe to tamper with it, and Professor Ariel told her to relax. Ariel opened the door, stating that it held no power. The door had been placed there merely as a symbol for a ritual that was not underway. Ariel stated that the power did not reside in the door, but rather in the magic circles around it. However, one of these magic circles began to emit a spark. Suddenly, the entire magic circle began to activate and glow intensely. Gray was in shock and asked if Ariel was trying to summon the liquidator or something similar. Bella Albright felt the impact and said the magic was too dangerous. Ariel said they shouldn't rush, as her prediction indicated that the structure could not summon the liquidator. However, the space around the door began to tear open, leaving the two in complete despair. Until suddenly, everything seemed to break down and shut off. Ariel stated that those devices were not created to summon the liquidator, but merely to open a small rift. Thus, they channel power directly from where the liquidator resides. The core they use to crystallize this power likely comes from human lives. Ariel notes that about 10 souls have been used so far, a molding process that requires sacrifices. She assumes that most of the people they saw upstairs were taken as raw material for this ritual. Bella Albright wonders why they went so far to gather so much power and what the objective behind it is. Ariel explains that the black flame variant used in the fight and the crystal that strengthened it are basically the blueprint for how these flames will be when they are ready. However, this conduit will not be limited to just flames. If they produce this en masse, no one knows what they will do. At that moment, the rifts in the open doorway begin to disappear. The hunter asks if Bradley, after all, wasn't trying to summon the liquidator. Ariel doesn't know, but states that he failed because the spatial opening circles reached their limit. She figures that was the most they could set up. Bella Albright states that this mechanism is extremely valuable, as she has never seen such powerful space-folding magic. Ariel agrees, as the construction of a single one of these devices would cost an entire nation's budget. With 8 such machines, Ariel imagines that a powerful organization must have funded all of this. Bella Albright considers the Discar Empire, but Ariel denies it. Even though it is the largest country in the world, the Empire does not possess the magical research resources to create a crystal like this. Ariel suspects an organization whose magical research surpasses even that of the Empire. The Hunter suggests the World Union Academy, and Ariel agrees. She states that no other research institution could sustain such a scale and budget. Bella Albright is surprised to hear that the Academy is behind everything. After all, the World Union Academy should defend the world from threats, not create them. Ariel understands Bella's reluctance to believe, but insists that no other group is capable of such a feat. The Hunter argues that this does not mean the entire Academy is their enemy, stating that the majority may still be on their side in this battle. Before the universe's redefinition, the Academy's elite forces were the ones who fought directly against the Liquidator. Even the subjugation teams continued protecting civilians until the very end. After seeing that future, the Hunter cannot believe that the Academy is an enemy of humanity. Ariel says that most of the Academy likely acts on behalf of humanity, and would not allow experiments that sacrifice lives. However, the Academy possesses a number of researchers and facilities whose full extent no one in this world completely knows. And whoever was behind Varian had enormous support. After all, Bradley could not have organized all of this with only his own authority. Bella Albright asks if they cannot fully trust the Academy, and Ariel replies that she has been observing it from the inside for decades. She states with certainty that it is not a trustworthy organization. After all, most people inside believe they are doing what is best for humanity, and those involved in this experiment have likely convinced themselves that they are acting for the greater good. The truth is now buried in the shadows before them. The Hunter asks if there is a way for them to find the mastermind behind everything, but Ariel sees no communication devices at the location, not even residual magic from the circle's creator, as the cleanup was thorough. Just as Ariel is about to finish speaking, everything begins to explode, startling the group. Ariel realizes that they installed evidence elimination mechanisms, which detonated the place the moment Bradley left. They probably planned to lure anyone investigating the site inside and then blow everything up. However, Bella Albright wants them to leave immediately, as the place is collapsing and exploding. Ariel tells them to calm down, as these are magical explosives, and the Academy's professors are not that weak. Therefore, she conjures a defensive spell and declares that she will not die in such a ridiculous way. Ariel instructs them not to leave the magic circle while she protects them. The structure continues to collapse, but they remain protected by Ariel's magic circle, until finally, they are teleported out of the location, along with the hostages. All those who were captured also managed to get out safely. Bella Albright and the Hunter thought they would not survive this time. The teleportation was slow, as there was a lot of weight to carry, but Ariel managed to perform it. Ariel knows that when they show this to the Academy, they will no longer be able to ignore it. The next day, Ariel speaks with the Academy's board of directors about what happened. The response is that the survivors are being treated in the Academy's medical wing. The director thanks them for stopping Varian Bradley's illegal experiments. Oradron Alexandro talks about the magical machines Bradley possessed. He says that each of them was worth more than an entire country's budget. Furthermore, there were 8 of them, and Varian could not have acquired all of that alone. Alexandro states that they are stolen goods. These products were intercepted mid-transport, and 78 agents were eliminated. Ariel and the group are shocked to learn that these crime-related eliminations are their doing. Ariel would not be surprised if some of them were within the Academy itself, and there is no way to distinguish them. Ariel and his group were outraged to learn that the criminals would not be punished, even if they were within the Academy. Ariel complained that, regardless of talent or lineage, novices would have no chance to grow stronger in this system. Director Alexandro explained that, even as criminals, they could be admitted and trained at the Academy. Bella considered this absurd, expressing her desire for the criminals to be punished. Alexandro replied that the superiors did not share this view. He clarified to Bella that, despite being a director, he and the others were subordinates. Even though he was the public face of the Academy, his authority was insignificant. He added that they could discover who truly controlled the academy if they became stronger. The more they proved themselves, the deeper they would be allowed to investigate the institution's secrets. Although he did not mention names, there was a veteran with enough influence to alter the academy's direction. Gray considered the idea of becoming stronger than this veteran so they could change the academy's rules. Director Alexandro reiterated that power was the essence of that place, and for that reason, it was strange that Ariel had not stood a chance against Varian Bradley. He understood that one of the two students had managed to eliminate Varian. The director admitted that the Divine Eye was sharp, and he could hardly wait to see what kind of monster she would train. Our hero, Gray, walked down the corridor and noticed the marks growing on his back. He realized that power governed that academy, and that if he wanted to take down the Liquidator, he would need to discover what was behind everything. First, they should focus on training to grow stronger. Suddenly, a boy appeared and tried to kick Gray's face. Gray defended himself in time, stepping back due to the impact. His aggressor said that Gray was more resilient than he expected, which annoyed the protagonist. The boy claimed that Gray acted as if he owned the academy. He declared that a rejected special admission student should not be in that corridor. Gray understood that this was one of those who hated special students and asked if he wanted trouble. The pale boy replied yes, but a second rejected student had just appeared. When Ariel appeared, the boy turned and left. Due to stricter surveillance, the boy could not get any closer. This confirmed that Varian Bradley would send someone soon. That strange boy had been sent by Varian Bradley to cause trouble. The boy told the teacher that the theoretical class student had just kicked him. He claimed that the Divine Eye Special Dimension student should not walk through the academy's corridors. However, without weapons or injuries, the teacher could not take a rational stance on the incident. She said that Gray should go after the student and beat him up. Gray and Ariel did not expect the situation to be resolved in this way. Arya, the teacher, said that technically she could not allow such an action, but she would pretend not to see. However, Gray preferred to leave the boy alone and not cause more trouble. Arya asked if the Divine Eye Special Dimension students were so hated. Gray stated that they were often mocked, but it was the first time the situation had escalated to physical aggression. Arya regretted that they were mocked and expressed her desire to have more authority at the academy. Gray, however, considered that if Arya had given up her scholarship because of the situation, he would not even be there, so he let it go. Furthermore, Bella was determined to prove that the divine programmer had not been a mistake. Gray added that his teacher had a divine eye. After all, in the future, the special students would become the heroes who would fight against the Liquidator. Ariel thanked Gray, but said that he should not act as if it were someone else's problem. She stated that, of the entire Divine Eye group, Gray was the one she had the highest expectations for. Amy White, Luke Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield were special students who would reach a high level, but it was the first time she truly believed someone could surpass humanity itself, and that person was Gray. Gray found it heavy to be compared to these great heroes. However, he considered this kind of thinking weak, for the brain behind Varian probably had not yet given up on summoning the Liquidator. Gray had returned to this timeline to ensure he could defeat the monster. He knew that the fate of that world was in his hands. The scene shifted to fencing class, which would be practical live combat. The teacher asked them to form pairs according to the list on the board. Gray remained very attentive to the practical discipline. After all, the other students would probably speak ill of the Divine Eye students again. He noticed that he had been paired with Leonhardt Apes, the best student in the fencing course and the strongest in the first year. The teacher grouped students of similar skill levels and instructed no one to go easy. Gray, however, thought that the skill level between him and Leonhardt was not similar. He thought he should not have been put to fight against the best student, considering he had barely entered the academy. However, Massaroy knew that Leonhardt, who hated the Divine Eye students, probably very much wanted to beat him. Leonhardt Apes calmly approached, expressing his satisfaction at being training partners. He felt flattered to fight Gray Lee, now that he was the best in the class. Leonhardt stated that he had trained harder than any other student with the goal of fighting alongside Gray. Massaroy noticed the intense gleam in Leonhardt's smile, realizing that he was relishing the prospect of being able to legally face him. Both, eager, headed to the center of the battlefield. All the students began battling each other, and Leonhardt immediately advanced on Gray Lee. Massaroy defended himself from Leonhardt's powerful sword strike. Then, Leonhardt delivered a horizontal slash that threw Massaroy backward. Soon after, he advanced again, emanating an intense aura, and his slash passed close to Gray. Gray Lee, in turn, delivered a massive blow, which was defended by the blonde-haired student. Leonhardt stated that Gray was strong, finding it hard to believe that he hadn't entered through normal admission. Their sword combat continued at high speed, with numerous blows exchanged. Massaroy thought he would lose quickly, but realized he was managing to keep up. However, he couldn't match Leonhardt's brute strength, even using both arms. Massaroy agreed that Leonhardt's swordsmanship was insane, perfected to a terrifying level. Even with the experience from his past life, and the training from his current master, the fight was difficult. Seeing Leonhardt advance again, emanating mana, Masaroy thought he was a monster. Their combat attracted the attention of the academy students, as Gray was managing to keep pace with Leonhardt. Leonhardt said he could fight like that all day, and was having immense fun. Meanwhile, Masaroy felt that his stamina wouldn't endure such heavy combat for much longer. If it weren't for the training with Professor Heathcote, he would already be on the ground, defeated. He wondered why Leonhardt wasn't even panting during the combat. Masaroy noticed he was losing stamina very quickly and needed to end the fight at that moment. He remembered that the professor had instructed them to fight as if it were a real battle. Then, Masaroy saw his enemy raise his arms to attack and noticed an opening. He dodged underneath, placed his hand on the ground for leverage, and delivered a kick to Leonhardt. He managed to execute a sweep that took his rival off his feet. Leonhardt was shocked to see him fight as if it were a real situation. However, the best student in the class couldn't afford to lose. The fight ended with both pointing their swords at each other's necks. When Gray Lee declared it a draw, Leonhardt disagreed. After all, in the last second, all Gray had done was swing his sword, while Leonhardt could have pierced and eliminated him if he wanted to. Because it was a simulated fight, Leonhardt forced himself to point his sword at Gray's heart, not his neck. Even with the protection, pointing the sword at the heart in a simulation was a significant gesture. Leonhardt Ape stated that he had lost that combat. Masaroy understood the difference between a real combat and a fencing practice. Leonhardt believed that fighting wasn't just about sword skill. Gray Lee stated that attacking with his foot was a kind of cheating for a fencing class. However, the instructor had said to treat the combat as real, so considering that, there was no cheating. Leonhardt called Masaroy for another round. Gray Lee didn't understand why Leonhardt had underestimated him, because in a direct confrontation, he wouldn't stand a chance. It wasn't just a matter of technique. Leonhardt's stamina left him far behind. At that moment, a student ordered them to stop what they were doing. He argued that whether it was real combat training or not, it was a fencing class. In other words, they shouldn't have used anything other than a sword. This arrogant student wondered how a special student was fighting against the best in the class. The student told Gray not to boast about having a bit of magic, and that Masaroy hadn't even chosen the combat. Leonhardt replied that the professor had decided Gray was the only one worthy of fighting him. The professor seemed to agree, stating that she had formed the pairs with students of similar overall strength. She stated that Gray was the only one who could face Leonhardt. She said that if the student disagreed, he should defeat Gray and become Leonhardt's opponent. The student, wanting to prove his point, stated that he had defeated the examiner to get there, and that he shouldn't be compared to those who barely passed the tie or didn't even pass the test. Dylan noticed that the student was underestimating Gray, treating him as a mere exhibition, without knowing his true strength. He thought it was a good idea, as Gray's power deserved recognition. More importantly, the student had interrupted the time Leonhardt would have had with Gray. Because of this crime, Leonhardt thought the annoying student deserved death. The teacher said that if they didn't like the real combat rule, they could use the fake stages. Masaroy knew that student wouldn't be easy to fight, as he had entered through the academy's normal processes. Gray was certain that his opponent possessed more stamina and strength. Even with brutal training, students couldn't overcome years of proper nutrition and conditioning. Gray didn't feel so confident in his abilities, but he accepted the challenge, as he wouldn't be expelled if he lost. Since it was just a practical class, the teacher asked them to go easy on each other. Both assumed their sword combat stances and advanced toward each other at high speed. The opposing student, Leon, wanted to put Gray in his place, calling him a loser. They engaged in a sword clash, and many sparks flew with each strike. At that moment, Gray twisted his wrist, throwing his opponent away. Gray noticed that his opponent struck with little force, and his strength didn't compare to Gray's. He considered that the opponent might be holding back for now. However, Gray saw the boy fall backward, dropping his sword. The opponent fell headfirst to the ground, and the teacher declared the end of the fight at that instant. The teacher apologized, explaining that she aimed for the sword but ended up hitting the student. The student replied that he was caught off guard and that it was a disaster. Crying, and with blood on his face, the student demanded a rematch. The teacher accepted the rematch request, allowing the fight to continue until the student gave up. The opposing student advanced against Gray again with all his strength. However, the confrontation ended the same way. The student, crying and badly injured. Seeing the student so injured, the teacher declared that the combat would be concluded. She also asked someone to take him to the infirmary. Thus, this year's representatives were Gray and Leon. The professor explained that the best first-year students would face the second-year champion. This was a battle that occurred between students of different years. The difference between the first and second years was notable, as the first-year students had lost 35 times. The professor stated that a year at the academy meant a lot, and that losing to the second year was considered normal. If they managed a good fight, they would already impress, and if they won, they would go down in academy history as a miracle. The professor advised them not to stress too much, as being called for this fight was already a privilege. Gray thought the battle between the years would be much more serious. As a special admissions student, Gray found this a perfect opportunity to prove his fighting ability. Gray was determined to train hard to fight the second-year champion. The director discussed Professor Budra's proposal at the school board meeting. Budra proposed that the Divine Eye special admission student, Amy White, be expelled. Ariel was responsible for managing the Divine Eye students. Budra argued that Amy White had failed the third-year advancement exam. Even so, she was allowed to remain at the academy because she was a special admission student. This seemed unfair, as the other students who failed were expelled. Ariel argued that Amy White was progressing toward world-class combat ability. Due to a very severe physical side effect, she couldn't display her full power. When Ariel said this, Budra complained that they were using the same excuse every time. He complained that her justification made even someone useless sound like a hidden prodigy. Ariel argued that if Amy White were pressured too early, she could lose her chance forever. Budra, visibly irritated, said that Ariel had used these comparisons before. He asked if her plan was to allow someone who doesn't meet the academy's standards to remain there. Ariel replied that the academy existed to cultivate exceptional talents and that they should keep her, even if she didn't fit the system's conventional standards. Budra retorted that special admissions were impressive in the past, but now they were taking up space improperly. He cited Amy White, Bella Albright, and Jacob Bloomfield as examples, stating that the Divine Eye program was losing its greatness. Another professor suggested abolishing the Divine Eye special admission, and Ariel was shocked. After all, it had been established long ago by a council of academy founders and could be abolished just as easily. Another professor opined that the current Divine Eye students were not impressing them and that the program had lost its sharpness. One of them mentioned that Bella Albright had improved, but this was not a great achievement, as she possessed little mana. However, the former Divine Eye students were in fact interesting. Therefore, half of those present were in favor, and half against the abolition, due to the legacy of the former students who made the program worthwhile. Ariel did not expect there to be more voices against the Divine Eye than she had imagined. At this rate, they could indeed end the program, and Budra stated that it was outdated. He asked if Ariel considered herself better at recognizing talent than they were. Ariel wanted to say yes, but she held back, knowing it would provoke them. She noticed that the professors already disliked her, and many cared more about the program's benefits for the academy. If she wanted to have them on her side, she could not say anything that would turn them against her. Budra reaffirmed that Ariel had already passed her prime, and that she no longer had valid arguments. Another professor mentioned that she had already achieved great things in the past. The professors argued that Professor Ariel should retire before losing her legacy. They added that if she wished to create favorite students at her will, she should open her own school. They scoffed, saying she would be lucky to find students willing to follow the Divine Eye in its current state. Ariel, for her part, knew that she could still recognize genuine talent, but these children needed more time to develop. Given time, they would prove their worth. She just needed to prevent them from being expelled before that happened. Professor Ariel desperately sought a way to prevent the expulsion of students from the Divine Eye program. It was then that one of the professors mentioned the Divine Eye student, Gray Lee. He had heard that Gray was promising among the first-year swordsmen. Budra, however, expressed skepticism, stating that the student did not seem promising. They would decide the future of the Divine Eye program after observing Gray's results in the upcoming competition. Ariel looked at Heathcote, who shook his head in denial. Professor Ariel stated that Gray's skill was not suitable for simulated fights. When she added that he only excelled in desperate situations, the professor became furious. He retorted that if the student could not demonstrate his skills in training, he would show nothing in real combat. Ariel, indignant, argued that they did not understand that Gray's skills did not fit common swordsmanship. At that moment, Alexandro ended the meeting, as the discussion was not progressing. He agreed that seeing the Divine Eye admitted student in action seemed like a good idea. Thus, the program's fate would be decided after Gray's fight. The meeting was adjourned, and Budra eagerly awaited the competition. Ariel felt powerless in the situation, and Heathcote noticed her discouragement. Professor Ariel knew that Gray and his power did not suit simulated fights. She knew that he still needed time, and that they were expecting something irrational from him. Even so, she ardently hoped that Gray could help the children with world-class potential. She hoped that he would protect the future of the special admission students. Finally, the day arrived, and the battle between the first and second years began. The competitors were introduced. Leonhardt, the best first-year student, Lionel Hartman, the best second-year student, the first-year challenger, Gray Lee, and finally, the second-year challenger, Diebel Redartle. Our hero, Gray, recognized Diebel as the same man who had kicked him in the hallway for no apparent reason. The professors were present to witness their abilities, all observing from the stands. Leonhardt did not understand why so many professors had come to watch the battle. The best second-year student commented that it was the first time so many professors had come to watch a fight. He wondered why there were so many professors today, since only 3 had attended the previous year. Apius suggested that the professors must have come because of Gray, praising his good taste. Boudre intervened, saying that Leonhardt was right and that everyone would witness the final battle for Divine Eye admission. He added that the Divine Eye class was being abolished. Gray was in shock and asked Ariel if that was true. Ariel knew that if she told Gray the truth, he would push himself too hard. She feared that he would use that power and that, in his current state, it could lead him to a fatal end. Ariel told Gray that Boudre was trying to destabilize him and that he shouldn't let it affect him in the fight. However, the protagonist noticed that his teacher was visibly trembling. Gray pretended to believe what the teacher said, but he knew the truth. Boudre hoped they would be humiliated in this confrontation against the second year. He stated that when they lost pathetically, the other teachers would realize that the Divine Eye didn't work. Gray didn't want to let that go and didn't like Boudre insulting teacher Ariel. Ariel was surprised by Gray Lee defending her judgment skills. Boudre retorted that those who hadn't become senile seemed convinced that Gray would lose pathetically. Gray replied that he would prove him wrong in the fight. Boudre was very annoyed by the boys' arrogance. The participants separated and went with their teammates to prepare for the combat. Teacher Ariel appreciated Gray's behavior, but she wondered what he might be planning. If he were fighting against the top student, his practical swordsmanship might have given him a small chance. However, he had fallen against a terrible opponent, Diebel Redartle. Bradley had manipulated Diebel's brain through surgeries, increasing his reflexes to an inhuman level. Diebel was the worst possible opponent for Gray's ambush tactics. Ariel greatly feared that the boy was planning to use his secret ability. She asked Gray not to worry about her, and also not to push himself too hard. Gray looked at her with a relaxed expression and said that he knew that. They announced the start of the top students' combat, and the representatives stepped forward. Ariel was protected with magic to prevent fatal injuries. Furthermore, activating the opponent's protective barrier is considered a victory, simulating a real combat. The battle between the top students of each year begins now. Leonhardt advances against the second year's top student, delivering a series of massive attacks with his sword. The opponent defends all blows with his own sword and counterattacks. However, Leonhardt acts quickly, throwing himself to the ground to deliver a kick to his opponent's face. However, Leonhardt realizes that he cannot fight with the same intensity as Gray Lee and feels exhausted. His rival comments that Leonhardt is even stronger than in his first year. However, the rival quickly recovers from the kick and declares that they will speed up the pace of the battle. Increasing the intensity, the rival asks if Leonhardt can keep up with him. Leonhardt, the blonde, manages to dodge some blows, but he is caught by surprise and his protective barrier is activated. Luenal is declared the winner of the fight between the top students. Next, the challengers' fight will begin, and the representatives take another step forward. Leonhardt passes by Gray and wishes him good luck in his combat. He adds that Gray must ensure his stay at the academy, especially after his statements. Gray mentally notes that he has faced monsters countless times before returning in time. Compared to those experiences, he concludes that Diebel must be entirely beatable. His rival Diebel approaches, dragging his sword across the ground. He declares that he will send Gray Lee to hell, just as he did with his teacher Bradley. The inter-year battle selection fight begins now. Gray charges head-on against Diebel. The swords clash, and a profusion of sparks erupts from the impact, until Diebel throws Gray away. Gray feels a weight, and his right arm begins to tremble as he holds the sword. Teacher Ariel had mentioned that Gray's reflexes and arm strength were enhanced. Realizing this disparity in strength, Gray concludes that none of his tricks will work against the sinister enemy. Questioning how he can fight against the stranger, Gray thinks of his secret ability. However, the teacher advised him never to use that power, regardless of the situation. Even if the tournament was important, it wouldn't be worth his life, as using that ability could lead to his death. Furthermore, the arena's defensive barrier might not withstand it, and he would run the risk of eliminating the opponent. At that instant, Diebel charges head-on against Gray. Thinking of protecting the Divine Eye's spot, Gray is ready to risk his life, but he doesn't wish to eliminate the opponent. Suddenly, Deebly crouches down and delivers an extremely heavy sword strike. Gray defends the blow and counterattacks with a downward motion. Gray manages to defend another attack from the stranger and realizes that Deebly's physical attributes and reflexes would easily overwhelm him. He notices that Deebly doesn't lack technique. Rather, he is holding back. Gray looks at the enemy's face and notices a sinister smile and a malicious gaze. Then, Deebly advances with a sword strike that Gray cannot dodge, and Gray feels that he will be hit. As he puts his sword forward, Gray realizes that he wouldn't have made it in time. He thinks that his enemy weakened the attack on purpose to force Gray to defend. From the stands, Teacher Ariel observes a purple power pulsating in Deebly's heart, noting that this energy is excessively unilateral, concentrated only on his left side. It is commented that this year's second-year students seem to have an unpleasant personality and could cause problems at any moment. The Divine Eye student is facing great difficulty blocking the second-year students' attacks. They consider this proof that the Divine Eye spot might be abolished. Budra opines that, at this rate, the special spot will become chaotic if they keep waiting for the students to develop. They agree that Budra is right and that he is a thoughtful student who thinks about the academy's well-being. Teacher Ariel orders them to stop the fight, as the situation is becoming too dangerous. Budra mocks her, stating that a simulated fight presents no danger. Another teacher explains that the arena is covered by a protection spell, and fatal attacks will be automatically blocked. Therefore, the students can fight seriously without fear, unless she has another reason to want to interrupt the battle. Even aware of the protection spell, Ariel realizes that it won't be enough to protect Gray. Suddenly, a burst of purple, malevolent mana erupted from the second-year student. Darkness enveloped his arm and sword as he charged a massive attack. As he launched the attack, a mana explosion occurred, splitting the arena in half. Furthermore, the protective barrier itself was destroyed in the process. The attack nearly hit Budra, and Ariel had warned about the barrier's destruction. Ariel became irritated as Bradley had implanted this magic in his student. She realized that the spectator's barrier was too strong, preventing her from using her prison magic. Ariel ordered them to cancel the tournament and deactivate the barrier, as it was an emergency. She yelled for Gray to flee, as stopping the fight from the outside would take time. Gray, however, did not believe fleeing would be useful, as turning his back would mean death. The students screamed in despair as they saw the arena tremble. She warned that the teacher's spells would take 30 seconds to reach them. Ariel considered it too early for such an action, but she trusted Gray's ability. She yelled for Gray to think of his body as an extension of his own sword. Ariel asked him to move his body in union with his power, and Gray began to ponder how to achieve this. Gray dodged an incredibly fast and powerful blow. He was determined to win, driven by his teacher's belief. The only option was for him and his sword to become one, and Gray focused intensely on this idea. A dark blow advanced with full force towards him, and Gray remained motionless. The moment the blow hit its target, an absurdly powerful mana explosion erupted. At that instant, Gray emanated a strong red aura, appearing right behind his opponent. The opponent was caught by surprise and, in Gray's perception, seemed to move with extreme slowness. This indicated that Gray had become excessively fast, and he struck his enemy from behind. Gray delivered a brutal blow, hitting his enemy's face with the sword. However, the opponent's protective barrier activated, saving him from the direct impact. Nevertheless, the barrier began to fragment gradually, and the residual impact struck the enemy. Deeble Redardle was forcefully thrown, colliding with and breaking the arena walls. Such was the power of Gray's attack. Gray managed to break the defense barrier and severely injure his opponent. Professor Heat asked if the other second-year student, Deeble Redardle, was all right. Immediately medics were called, and Deeble Redardle, Bradley's student, began to stand up. He rose, emanating dark magic, and appeared to be unharmed. Ariel warned Gray to stay alert, as the fight was not yet over. Suddenly, Deeble Redardle advanced ferociously, casting dark magic against Gray. Tentacles of dark magic began to devastate the arena and attack Gray Lee. Ariel asked if the barrier had still not been deactivated, and Professor Heat confirmed he was trying. Meanwhile, Gray continued to dodge, performing high-speed jumps. Deeble Redardle, who had been attacking from a distance, suddenly closed the gap and charged at Gray. They engaged in another sword clash, generating a profusion of sparks. Gray realized that his enemy did not seem to be an ordinary human, given the abysmal speed and strength he demonstrated. Although Gray was also far from normal, manifesting immense power at that moment. Gray managed to disengage from the sword clash and position himself behind Deeble Redardle, who, surprisingly, seemed unharmed after Gray's most powerful attack. Gray delivered an attack from behind the opponent. The exact moment Gray underestimated his enemy's speed, he himself suffered an attack, spitting out a large amount of vital fluid. His teacher, Ariel, screamed in shock, fearing that her favorite student would die. Feeling intense pain, Gray understood that if he didn't react, he would lose the fight. With the urgent need for more power, Gray plunged into an obsession, and his aura visibly changed. Then, Gray delivered a cut that severed both of his opponent's arms. An inexplicable source of power emerged within Gray, compelling him to deliver that fatal blow. From the enemy's two severed limbs, a large amount of darkness began to emanate. The teachers observed the scene in complete shock, until the barrier was finally deactivated, allowing the teachers to enter the arena. All the teachers advanced to stop the fight and imprisoned Deeble Redardal. Gray leaned on his sword, overcome by exhaustion, and felt a sharp pang in his heart. From several gashes on his body, vital fluid began to gush, indicating that he was severely wounded. Ariel instantly used healing magic. Realizing that her student was at risk of death, she ordered the other teachers to assist in Gray's healing process. Ariel felt Gray's vital signs stabilize, and a few moments later, he stood up. The teachers were shocked by the speed of his recovery and asked if he was all right. Ariel realized that even after using all his power, Gray's soul was intact. She stated that there should be no more injuries, as the healing magic had already resolved the situation. They noticed that the strategy worked, weakening the counterattack as Heat had predicted. Ariel declared that without the healing magic, Gray could have died, and she showed irritation with Heat. Heat retorted, arguing that they managed to mitigate the damage to a level where the healing magic would be effective. In any case, Heat intended to support the counterattack alone, which would take time. Several unexpected occurrences followed, but Deeble Redardal was already being taken to the infirmary. Through these unexpected events, something important would be confirmed. The protective barrier of the second-year representative, Deeble Redardal, was activated by Gray Lee's attack. Therefore, the winner of the fight was the first-year representative, Gray. The students began to celebrate, as Gray had achieved a historic feat by defeating a second-year student. The Divine Eye student ended the first-year student's streak of 35 consecutive defeats. Heat declared that this count no longer mattered. After this fight, it became clear that Ariel's judgment was not wrong. Everyone had to admit that she was right, and the abolition of the Divine Eye class was discarded. The director expressed his shame for having considered abolishing the class, almost losing an immense talent. Ariel deeply thanked Gray Lee, who was still recovering from his injuries. Those who wished for the abolition of the class would now have to reflect on their own responsibility. Budra found himself in a complicated situation, feeling ashamed. Gray Lee lied, claiming he did not know he could use that ability. Ariel noticed the lie, as Gray Lee had freely used this ability when defeating the Ogre General. He hoped his teacher would support him in his deception. To stop the Executor, Gray Lee needed to be the only one to possess such power. Ariel understood his intentions, and noticed that he did not act like someone living for the first time. However, knowing the trust Gray Lee placed in her, Ariel decided to support him. She informed the director that Gray Lee's power could not be analyzed by conventional magic methods, but that she could perceive it with her own eyes. Ariel had observed Gray Lee's power and discussed it with Heatcoat, which made the boy's current level of control possible. Ariel was still researching the best way to extract and enhance this power. She asked if she could be in charge of everything related to Gray Lee's power. After witnessing the fight, Director Alexandro could not refuse Ariel's offer. Director Alexandro told Ariel that the entire Divine Eye Special Group was now Gray Lee's responsibility. He stated that if there was anything the Academy could do to help, Ariel should inform him. Both were pleased that they had managed to keep the Divine Eye group safe. Next, they went to the underground alley to examine Deeble Redardal's condition. The director wanted the Divine Eye members by his side. Ariel accompanied the director to analyze the situation. Upon analyzing the results, they found that the power used on Deeble Redardal was almost identical to that of the Executor, leaving no doubt that the same crystals from the research center had been used. The director asked what had happened to Deeble, and Ariel replied that he had passed away. Ariel explained that the moment the attack was activated, Deeble Redardal ceased to be himself. The power might have corrupted him as soon as it was implanted, making it obvious that the main target was Gray Lee. This was retaliation for Gray Lee eliminating Varian Bradley. Deeble Redardal was manipulated after Varian Bradley's death, which indicated the involvement of a third group. Ariel and Gray Lee understood that there was a larger enemy behind them, a third group. Ariel said it would take some time to use her connections and find this group. Her intuition indicated that the deeper layers of the Academy were involved. Gray Lee offered to help his Divine Eye teacher. He commented that he had learned to use his power without damaging his soul. However, Gray Lee mentioned that the impact on his body had been worse than before. Heatcoat suggested they elevate the training to the next stage. Ariel stated that Gray Lee would learn to control the power better than he currently could. After the conversation, Gray Lee headed to the training ground. Heatcoat explained that the training method was dangerous and painful. He added that if Gray Lee was willing to take more time, there were safer options. Gray Lee decided to train that way, and Heatcoat instructed him to prepare. Gray Lee focused on becoming one with his blade, remembering the sensation he had experienced. A red aura began to emanate from the blade, spreading throughout his body as he prepared. He delivered a straight strike, destroying the armors on the battlefield. As he ran, he delivered slashes with his sword, eliminating the targets. The watching teachers noticed the boy's impressive speed. Gray Lee delivered another attack, eliminating another armor. However, the rebound effect manifested in his body, and he began to expel vital fluid. After delivering another spinning attack, he fell to his knees on the ground. Weakened, Gray Lee fainted, becoming completely unconscious. The teachers instantly activated recovery magic to restore his health. In moments, Gray Lee felt well and stood up. Heatcoat commented that Gray Lee was enduring more than in previous times, and that his body would learn to resist the impact. Gray Lee hadn't even noticed this, as he was deeply focused in a state of flow. Now that he felt it, he noticed that the power hurt him considerably. The professor explained that the pain meant he was surpassing his personal limits. However, Heatcoat also understood that the training was excessive, and the decision to continue or not would depend on Gray Lee. Gray Lee decided to continue, and they set off for another round of training. However, Professor Ariel appeared and ordered them to stop the training, stating that it should be limited to only once a day. Gray Lee argued that with that method, the soul would not be harmed, and the body was already healed. Ariel replied that physical wounds could be healed with recovery magic. However, if Gray suffers severe damage again, his destabilized nerves would confuse his senses. Ariel added that he understood this better than anyone, and that it would mean losing the movement of his hand again. Heatcoat agreed, stating that he would also hesitate to repeat this type of training multiple times a day. One of the mages questions Gray's haste to become stronger, considering his already impressive power. Ariel takes the blame, explaining that she was the one who led Gray to fight Bradley. Now, people will come after him seeking revenge, and the incident with Deeble was just the beginning. She reveals that there are people operating in the shadows of the Academy, including criminal groups who stole the magic catalyst for Bradley. If they isolate Gray somewhere with heavy security, she doesn't know if they will be able to protect him. Therefore, becoming stronger is the boy's only path to survival. Gray insists that stopping the Executor experiment was his own choice, not hers. Deep down, Gray's true motive is to stop the Liquidator. Ariel states that Gray is an exceptional student and that she will do everything to help him develop his power to its fullest. Heath realizes that Ariel has something in mind upon hearing her words. Ariel asks Gray if he wants to know the fastest and safest way for a swordsman to become stronger. Heath suggests that changing the sword is the quickest solution for this strengthening. The sword provided by the Academy was supposed to be a high-level custom weapon. Ariel explains that, although it is sufficient for a freshman, the sword cannot withstand Gray's power. She observes that no ordinary sword is capable of handling the magnitude of his power. Upon seeing the broken sword, the professor decides to take him to her personal vault. Heath is surprised by the idea of the professor giving one of her weapons to the student. She spins a key in the air, opening a portal, and states that Gray is worthy of receiving one of her weapons. Gray is in complete shock upon hearing his professor's words. Upon entering the professor's vault, Gray sees piles of gold coins, noticing the vast wealth and numerous magical objects. The place is gigantic, and Ariel begins to search for the weapons section. After much searching, they find the section, and Ariel instructs Gray to find a sword that suits him. Gray realizes that many of the swords there look dangerous, no matter how much he observes them. Heath doubts that Gray will find a better collection of swords than that one. Ariel acknowledges that it is difficult to decide with so many options available. Normally, she would like to test each one, however, due to the nature of Gray's power, they can only do this once. Thus, they will decide to test the swords one by one, starting with the sharpest one in the place. Gray picks up an extremely heavy and large sword for the first test. Ariel states that no matter how heavy it is, the sword cuts with extreme precision. A wooden totem appears so that Gray can test the weapon. Gray positions his feet, rotates his torso, and delivers a massive sword strike. The sword's blow completely destroys the wooden totem, and the blade remains intact. Ariel comments that the sword is powerful, but perhaps a bit too heavy for a real fight. Heath observes that no matter how sharp it is, the sword is useless if it cannot hit any target. However, it wouldn't hurt to have it, as it would be useful against robust and heavy opponents. Ariel decides to give Gray a magical storage pouch so that he can carry it without the weight being a hindrance. Gray asks if this sword can normally be lent to someone. Ariel replies that it is better to give it to him than to leave it gathering dust in her warehouse. Furthermore, she is entrusting the sword into the hands of someone who can truly use it well. And when Gray is facing the enemy behind Varian, the Executor's summoner, he will be able to say that this man will regret not having had this sword by his side. Gray remembers the painful defeat he suffered against the Liquidator, and this motivates him. He thanks the professor for lending him the sword. Heath warns that Gray should avoid showing the sword to other people without the intention of using it. If it were put on the market, it would be worth at least 10 billion and 10,000 gold coins. Gray is in shock upon learning the sword's value and hesitates to accept it because it is so expensive. Ariel refuses to take it back, as she is giving the sword, not lending it. Gray cannot believe that she is entrusting such an expensive sword to him. Ariel says that if she could protect the Divine Eye's admission with 10 billion, she would gladly do so. However, the sword is a delayed reward for what the boy did in saving the Divine Eye. Then, she threatens him comically, asking if the Divine Eye is not even worth the price of 10 million. Immediately, Gray backs down from the comical situation and thanks Ariel. The Black Swordsman states that he will take very good care of this giant blade. Furthermore, Ariel wants him to have a normal weapon that he can use in common battles. Gray would never have imagined that Professor Ariel's treasure would be so impressive. Heath comments that no one in the world possesses an eye as sharp as Ariel's. After all, with a divine eye, she can make as much money as she wants. Ariel asks Heatcoat, the instructor, which of the weapons he would recommend. Analyzing the options, Heatcoat points to a golden-hilted weapon. Gray picks up the thin, ordinary-looking blade to test it. He delivers a few precise and swift strikes with the sword. Although the sword seems well-made, Gray feels that something is wrong. Heatcoat promptly states that that sword does not suit Gray. Next, he mentions a sword created for an experiment, suggesting that it might be more suitable for the protagonist. Heatcoat presents a sword adorned with several glowing blue designs. The professor instructs Gray to try wielding the spatial sword. As soon as Gray touches the hilt, the sword begins to glow, and he is impressed. He notices that the blade has no sharp edge, which seems strange to him. Heatcoat explains that this sword was developed as a new technology experiment, not for real combat. It was designed to be extremely durable, despite being made of a blunt steel. Gray understands the professor's idea. With the power he possesses, he might not need a sword with a sharp edge. Heatcoat argues that no matter how powerful it is, a normal sword would hardly withstand Gray's power. He adds that if Gray continues to grow stronger, conventional swords will become a burden. In that scenario, Gray should consider a future where he would no longer need to rely on the sword's edge to fight. For this reason, the technological sword could be perfect for him. Heatcoat demonstrates how the sword works. It not only leaves gashes, but also deforms the attacked object. Ariel, for her part, believes that Gray should continue wielding a normal sword. She asks if there are other weapons he would like to try, mentioning that there are options beyond swords. Gray observes some axes and other weapons, but expresses a desire to test all available swords. He notices an entirely red sword, which appears to be lighter and stronger than the previous ones. Gray also wants to try another sword, a very long one, from which he senses a strange energy. Ariel explains that this sword was left behind by a student who graduated. Even though it is not a famous sword, Ariel allows him to test it, and Gray shows great interest. Upon wielding it, he finds it surprisingly easy to hold, as if it fit his hand like a glove. The sword is gleaming and allows for fine and precise cuts. He realizes that the sword fit perfectly, as if he had practiced with it since birth. Gray states that he had never wielded such an easy sword in his entire life. Ariel suggests that he test another sword to check its compatibility with his power. Gray asks if there would be any problem if he broke the former student's sword. Ariel replies that she is sure the sword would be happier being used by him than remaining idle. Gray agrees and asks the name of the student who created the sword. Ariel reveals that the student's name is Medallum Norum, and Gray is shocked. After all, he remembers Medallum Norum as the greatest magic blacksmith in the world. Gray is astounded to realize that he is using a sword forged by Medallum Norum. Next, they head to the training arena to test Medallum Norum's sword. The objective is to test both the blade's strength and durability, and Ariel wants Gray to push the sword to its limit. First, however, Ariel hands Gray the sword made with experimental technology. They decide to start with the most unusual sword to observe how Gray's power would affect it. Gray focuses on becoming one with the sword, emanating his mana to its fullest. He loses connection with the sword and tries again, enveloping it with his magic. He immerses it in his power, seeking to become one with the blade. However, his power does not activate with this sword, and Gray finds this strange. He tells Ariel that he feels no difference from his normal physical condition. Therefore, the sword might be the cause, and they decide to set it aside. Apparently, it does not function correctly with Gray's special powers. Given this, they decide to try with the most normal sword from the set this time. Ariel takes a sword from inside a magical box and asks Gray to try it. Again, he performs the focusing process to become one with the blade and prepares for the attack. This time, he manages to activate his power, emanating an intense aura. Suddenly, he hears a voice in his head saying, "There's no more time." The voice adds that when the time comes, something will happen. Heathcote comments to Ariel that releasing the power should not be a problem with the other sword. After hearing the voices, Gray advances against the training objects, delivering precise and strong attacks. He notices that the power of the blows is the same as before, but the sword swing is much smoother. He delivers a vertical cut that destroys the training armor. His body also feels lighter, and he runs, delivering several sword strikes with ease. He breaks several armors, and the mages present notice that Gray is different from the last training session. Gray runs throughout the training area, eliminating all the armors he encounters. With impressive speed, he feels as if he is flying through the arena. As he delivers the last cut to an armor, he notices a bit of vital fluid dripping from his mouth. Gray realizes that although the number of targets was the same as before, he took them all down at once. Previously, he could only hit about half, but now all had fallen. Furthermore, Gray remains standing, without falling unconscious like last time. However, the observers notice a lot of vital fluid dripping from his chest, revealing a large cut. Professor Ariel becomes desperate and orders him to drop the sword immediately. Lee and Gray obey. Gray drops the sword and falls to his knees on the ground. The professors rush to support him and cast their healing magic to help him. Gray starts to become extremely weak, and one of the professors asks him to stop exerting himself so much. Ariel explains that losing so much vital fluid will drain his stamina, and he should rest immediately. After all, he surpassed a limit he couldn't before, and this could be a divine sign. If Gray moves without realizing his own condition, it will be very dangerous. In a true combat, without a healer, he will need to be more careful. Looking at the blade, Gray realizes it doesn't have a single scratch, even after all the combat. Using his divine eye, he notices that the sword emits a stronger glow and has withstood the full intensity of the combat. Suddenly, Ariel notices something different in the sky and becomes alert. A pink magic explosion occurs at the World Union Academy. Everyone is shocked, and the location begins to be attacked and crumble. Students flee as debris falls in front of them. All Academy instructors create magical barriers to protect the students. Heathcote explains that the attacked area houses a vault containing dangerous materials. The explosion was clearly caused by someone who wished to steal them. Immediately after the explosion, he saw someone use teleportation magic in a fraction of a second. They consider this impossible, as the vault walls are protected by anti-teleportation magic and were also built to withstand most explosive spells. Ariel noticed executioner magic mixed with the smoke. They probably used the crystals produced in the underground laboratory to destroy the outer wall. Gray understands that those responsible for the explosion were allies of Varian Bradley. They truly made a move against the Academy's headquarters. As expected, several items were stolen from the vault. Although the details haven't been shared, it's not the kind of place where an outsider could cause an explosion. By the way they destroyed the teleportation inhibitor and fled, it seems to have been an inside job. This suggests that the Academy is no longer a trustworthy organization. Ariel wonders if they ever truly were a trustworthy organization. Gray states that if the Academy is controlled by the enemy, they can use their influence to obtain whatever they want. But the reason they exploded the vault is because there was no legal way to obtain the stolen item. Ariel doesn't know what the higher-ups think, but the culprits are blood drinkers. They must have infiltrated the Academy, and Gray remembers that they eliminated Bella's father. The professor says that by eliminating Varian, Gray could become their target as well. Therefore, she instructs him not to let his guard down, especially when he is outside the Academy. After this dialogue with the professor, Gray descends the stairs. Upon arriving in the classroom, he notices the students in despair, trembling intensely. Sensing the heavy atmosphere, he assumes it has to do with the explosion at the Academy. Gray received a notification about an outdoor exercise, and that's why everyone is scared. Gray tells Leon that he read the letter and feels no fear. It is a mission of 16 hours of marching and camping in a monster-infested area. A week dedicated solely to this, and the extra combat training will be heavy. Leon asks how Gray can be so calm, considering 16 hours of marching per day, and there's no guarantee of a good night's sleep due to the monsters that might appear. It is mentioned that more than half of the students give up every year because of this task. Gray explains that in real marches for battle, one never knows when the enemy will attack. When he went through the executioner subjugation training with his squad, there was no time limit. They threw the warriors into the mountains and made them march through the infested forest for a week. Some of them died after being attacked by monsters during the training. With the professors accompanying them now, that kind of thing won't happen. Leon realizes that not even hellish exercises intimidate the boy, who is at an advanced level. Seeing everyone scared, Gray can't help but feel that something is lurking outside. The professor announces that they will begin the annual outdoor exercise for the freshmen. Most of those who fail to overcome this challenge will likely give up and not advance to the second year. The professor urges them to persevere, and so, the mission begins. Our protagonist arrives at the edge of the Wintley continent. Gray remembers that the region is practically uninhabited and wonders why. Beginning their march into the forest, the students follow the professors. One of the students comments that this does not seem to be the correct path, to which the professor replies that training, by its very nature, must follow the most challenging path. Then they follow the professor up a steep trail, and exhaustion begins to set in. The professor then reveals that only 8 hours have passed since they started, and they are only halfway through the march. The students, already exhausted, realize that half the journey still remains, and that it is only the first day. The professor explains that their bodies will get used to it over time, and that the hardest part is always the beginning. Leon and the others, however, realize that the professor is lying, as the difficulty and fatigue persist intensely. Ignoring the professor's words, they observe that Leon shows no sign of fatigue. Leon thinks that this is the highlight of the Swordsman course, and that he needs to push himself to the limit. He also notices that Gray Lee has not lost his breath since the mission began. Suddenly, an exhausted female student is attacked by a spider, startling her greatly. The spider almost hits her in the face, but Gray saves her by accurately throwing a dagger. Our black swordsman eliminates the creature and warns that many spiders in the region are venomous. Leon observes that Gray is not just walking, but also constantly assessing the environment for surprise attacks. To be able to walk for 8 hours and still maintain such a level of readiness, Gray must have undergone intense training. Gray has good stamina because the training he underwent before returning in time helped him greatly. For Gray, getting a good night's sleep is already a significant improvement compared to the hellish experiences of his past life. What truly worries him is Ariel's comment about the need to keep one's guard up outside the academy walls. These training exercises take them to open areas with little security. Furthermore, the academy members know the exact location of the students. So, our hero prays that nothing bad happens during this outdoor training. At that moment, the professor instructs them to stop. Exhausted, they ask the professor what is happening. The professor announces that from now on, they will undertake a meal training exercise. Everyone becomes visibly happy, imagining the feast that awaits them. They thank for the break, eager for the amount of food they expect to consume. Gray, however, has a bad feeling, especially because of the exercise's name, which involves meal. The professor clarifies that it is not a break to eat, but rather a lesson. On a march, when one eats, one also cooks. He divides them into squads, ensuring that the strength of each group was as balanced as possible. The professor informs them that each squad will have a designated space with basic utensils to prepare their meal. In Squad C are Leonhard Apius, Plua, Hides, and Bias, while in Squad D, Gray Lee is the leader along with Bask, Rumia, and Banas. Gray wonders if he will be a good leader, as he fears that no one will want to listen to the special student of the Divine Eye. The students of Squad D introduce themselves to Gray and seem to be friendly. They appear calmer than he expected, as Gray imagined they would not like taking orders from him. Gray asks if they are comfortable with him being the leader, but the students do not understand his doubt. For them, after Gray's victory, there would be no one more suitable for leadership. Considering him the most trustworthy, they quickly grab the equipment and ask what the next instructions are. Gray notices a change in attitude. The previous match truly left a good impression. He realizes that at the academy, everything comes down to merit. A student asks what they should do, since the supplies provided by the professor do not contain enough food. The student explains that he only has a pot and a fire starter, and nothing else. Professor Heat explains that on a real field march, no food or cooking equipment is provided. Apius argues that modern field operations rely on logistical support and magical storage. The professor says this only applies to marches that were planned in advance. The professor confronts him, explaining that in emergency situations, where they need to camp in the middle of a battle, or if the supply officer dies, they will need a prolonged march without any preparation. Furthermore, magical storage bags are too valuable. If they are not part of a large-scale unit, each person will have to carry their own equipment on their back, exactly as they are doing on this march. Many will end up giving up, unable to do anything. The students become quiet listening to this, and Leonhardt apologizes. Gray didn't know that storage bags were so rare. He had accepted his as if it were a simple sword bag, and now he understands that it is an item of great value. Their professor also has good news for the students. The professor informs them that the forest is infested with monsters, but that they have spread magical repellent along the path. The professor announces that they won't need to worry about finding food, because without the repellent, monsters will emerge. The students understand that by releasing the monster repellent, the creatures will begin to lurk through the forest. In Squad D, the members ask their leader, Gray, what they should do. Gray replies that they should hunt the monsters and feed on them, as it is the only option. While paying attention to the path, Gray spotted footprints and droppings, indicating the presence of small and medium-sized monsters. Gray believes they will be able to deal with them using only a sword, but the squad shows apprehension about engaging in real combat, as the idea of searching for monsters in such a vast forest seemed daunting. Gray explains that if the monsters are carnivorous, the task will be easier, as they will come to meet the group. He adds that if they remain still, they will compete with the other squads for prey, so they must move. If they don't want to fight monsters, they can find insects and snakes to feed on. In forests without monsters, they learn to make good use of insects as food. However, one of the girls in the group expresses a desire to hunt monsters, since they are in a forest full of them. Another student, however, states that Gray is the leader and that they will follow his orders. Thus, Squad D enters the forest and begins to look for monster footprints. Gray smells a peculiar scent and warns that the monsters are approaching. Suddenly, a fierce bear emerges from behind a bush. The beast charges at one of Squad D's members. The group member is shocked to see the real monster so close. He narrowly dodges, surprised by the creature's speed. His body reacts instinctively, moving on its own, a result of the brutal training exams he underwent at the academy. He draws his sword, positions himself behind the monster, and declares that he should not be underestimated. He delivers a deep cut that severely wounds the beast, causing it to spill its vital fluid. Immediately after the blow, the bear reacts, using its claws to attack the student. However, before the student could actually be hit by the bear, Gray intervenes and saves his life. With a precise sword strike, Gray severs one of the bear's hands, preventing his friend from being fatally wounded. Next, the creature uses its remaining arm to attack Gray, who delivers another sword strike, severing the wild creature's left hand. In moments, Gray finishes off the monster and sheathes his sword, commenting that the beast's bones were tough. His teammate thanks Gray for saving his life. Gray explains that wild monsters can continue moving even after seemingly fatal attacks. He advises his colleague to prioritize not getting hit, instead of focusing only on finishing off the monster. The squad member comments that the experience is completely different from training with people. Next, they take the bear meat and roast it over a campfire. The students consider the bear meat good enough. Gray explains that the taste of monster meats varies by species. He adds that when participating in expeditions, it is always important to research the list of local monsters. Gray recommends hunting wild boars if they need to collect food in an unknown location, because wild boars generally do not feed on poisonous plants, and their meat has a decent taste. Gray responds to a colleague mentioning that he studied survival techniques in addition to swordsmanship. He tries to be modest, stating that he doesn't know that many things about survival. Suddenly, another squad emerges from the woods and asks them to share the food. After all, the food they had managed to get didn't work out, and they even tried to eat frogs. Gray comments that the amount of food they have would be enough to feed an entire class. So, he shares the food, and the students from the other squad become excited. However, the professor intervenes, stating that food exchanges between teams are prohibited and that each person must hunt their own. The professor removes the squad from the spot, and they return sadly in search of more food. After another march, the professor announces that they will set up camp at their current location. He informs them that, from now on, it will be a field camping exercise. The students are happy to have eaten properly, while some collapse exhausted on the ground. A student asks if they will need to get more food for the rest of the training, but Professor Rent replies that, for the camp, they received canned food and individual tents. They must collect materials and set up the tents and campfires in the designated locations. They will also simulate attacks and surprises during the night, and the teams will need to establish watches. They can use any method to prevent surprise attacks. The professor hears some students whispering about strategies that go beyond the rules. He states that the students were deliberately spread out so they couldn't relax. Thus, the professor announces that the training will begin immediately. The less time the slower ones take to act, the more sleep they will get during the night. Gray discusses how many people will be needed for the night watch. His colleagues suggest that if they use 2 people per shift, they will have half the night to sleep. Gray then agreed to the idea of only one person taking the night watch. One of his teammates commented that the first and last shifts would be calmer, while those on the middle shifts would have their sleep interrupted. For this reason, Gray volunteered for the second shift and asked if anyone would be willing to take the third. The purple-haired boy, whom Gray had saved earlier, promptly accepted the third shift. Rumia, Bask, and Benas volunteered for the first night watch shift. At the end of each shift, the person in charge was supposed to wake up the next person on the list before going to sleep. While Gray slept, Rumia remained awake, watching around the campfire. Suddenly, a figure with a dagger in hand began to move stealthily towards Gray's tent. Rumia, on her watch, began to feel an overwhelming drowsiness. The moment the man approached, Gray woke up. He had heard a strange noise moments before and immediately stood up, brandishing his sword. Gray knew that if it were a monster, the sound would have been much louder and more chaotic. It was, without a doubt, a human. Someone who did not wish to be noticed as they moved. Peeking through the tent flap, Gray saw nothing but Rumia, almost asleep. Realizing she hadn't noticed the noise, he wondered if it was all just an illusion of his mind. However, Gray followed his intuition that someone was nearby and stood up. He thought it might be the professor, checking if they were maintaining proper vigilance at that hour. However, Gray did not let his guard down and decided to investigate. He remembered Ariel, who had warned him that after defeating Varia, he would become a target for bloodsuckers. And finally, her advice that he should be very careful upon leaving the academy. He wondered if it was an assassin and decided he should act as if it were, taking the necessary precautions. Gray knew that long-range attacks were a possibility, and that it would not be prudent to remain still there. Gray left the tent without alerting Rumia, the girl from his group, and began to sneak through the forest. He noticed the sky illuminated by a full moon, which made the situation similar to a daytime attack. It was easier to detect the enemy, but conversely, harder to hide. Gray moved cautiously, remembering his divine bow training. In his past life, Ariel had explained that the correct way to walk started from the back of the feet. One needed to move on the tips of their toes to ensure silence. This way, the heel touched the ground last, minimizing noise. Even if they stepped on a branch or leaves, the sound would not resemble the regular rhythm of human footsteps. Instead, it would sound more like animals or the wind, not attracting unwanted attention. During the divine bow training, they walked barefoot through the mountains, seeking to become one with nature. Gray followed these instructions to the letter. Shortly after, he spotted the man with the dagger in his hand. Gray used stones to lure the intruder, who fell into the trap. Immediately, Gray pointed his sword at the man's neck, ordering him to stay still. He forced him to answer his questions, threatening to eliminate him otherwise. Gray asked his name and what affiliation he belonged to. However, Gray noticed that it was the old mustachioed professor. He asked if this was another one of the surprise attacks for academic purposes. The professor explained that he was checking if Gray was properly guarding the area. However, he did not expect to be approached from behind, unnoticed, with a sword at his throat. At this point, he couldn't tell who was teaching more, if it was him or Gray. Gray imagined the professor was faking it and decided not to lower his guard. If the professor truly wanted to attack him, he would be carrying a more lethal weapon. Considering it safe to trust the professor, Gray finally lowered his blade. At that moment, Rumia appeared, sword in hand, to check the sounds. Seeing the professor and Gray there, she asked what they were doing. The professor explained that he was checking if the group was maintaining proper vigilance, and that Gray had noticed him even before he arrived. He stated that their vigilance was impeccable, and that he had never seen freshmen set up such a perfect camp. Rumia commented that Gray should have been sleeping and she doing the watch. The professor found it strange that Gray hadn't been assigned to the watch, and Gray in turn asked if the professor had stepped on a branch as he approached. The professor confirmed that he had, indeed, stepped on one, and Gray explained that he recognized the sound as coming from a human. The professor was surprised that Gray had perceived the imminent attack just by the sound of a branch while he was sleeping. Gray replied that he wasn't in a deep sleep yet, and that it was merely a coincidence. The professor began to laugh, because in addition to the simulated battle the day before, Gray continued to surprise the academy. He wondered if there was still anything they needed to teach Gray Lee. Then, he announced that Gray was banned from participating in the night watch training. After all, if he handled everything alone, the other students wouldn't learn anything. Gray asked if the absence of one person in the squad would mess things up. The professor replied that Gray's group would not receive surprise attacks between 1 and 3 in the morning. Gray Lee's group, even without him, would receive a perfect score in the vigilance training, with no extra conditions. The professor noted this information and instructed the group to proceed with the training, excluding Gray Lee. Surprised, the professor realized that Gray Lee had approached from behind without him noticing his presence. He wondered if the protagonist could belong to some elite stealth unit. However, he considered that impossible for someone so young. Still, he recognized that Gray Lee's skill was unquestionably high. This realization led the professor to question Gray Lee's true identity. At dawn, the professor announced that they could resume the march. All the students felt a deep drowsiness, as they had barely slept due to the constant alerts. The Black Swordsman, Gray Lee, continued to lead Squad D, showing no signs of fatigue. The next day, after a long march, night fell again. They prepared to camp once more, hoping to finally be able to rest. The professor announced that the day's training was over and that there would be no more strenuous activities. The tents had already been set up, and they could relax while the food wasn't ready. Everyone ate, and exhausted, collapsed onto their beds. Gray Lee, however, found the permission for so much rest strange. He was certain that the next day would be hellish, even worse than the previous ones. Leon talked with Gray Lee, expressing his confidence that he would excel in any training. Professor Heathcote prepared a true feast for all the students. The professors brought large buckets, informing them that there was plenty of food and that they could have seconds as they wished. After surviving 2 days of brutal training, they deserved a rest and a night to recover their energy. At that moment, the professor gave a malicious smile, aware that the next day would be even more challenging. The next day, the march resumed, and they soon came across an imposing mountain. The training in the dangerous transversal zone of Mount Gastia was about to begin. The student groups followed the professor along the path leading to Mount Gastia. Although the students had been startled upon seeing the mountain for the first time, their current pace gave them confidence. So far, no one had fallen, which was expected from individuals who had passed the academy's rigorous entrance exam. However, the professor warned that the real training would begin at that moment, because in approximately 2 kilometers, they would enter the territory of the water lizards. These animals were considerably stronger than those encountered during the food foraging training. Most of the students could be eliminated or even perish in this fight. Fear spread among them at the prospect of facing such lethal monsters. The professor instructed them that they must move undetected, as it was a 2-week training in a dangerous area. Water lizards did not move during dry seasons to conserve their energy. If the students avoided loud noises, perhaps the lizards would not even notice their presence. However, because it was the dry season, they were thirsty for any type of liquid. An example of what they might drink was the vital fluid of human beings. If the water lizards detected them, death would be almost instantaneous. This reminded Gray Lee of the old training he underwent in the Divine Bow hunting monsters. The professor commented that the training should be easy for Gray Lee, who already had experience hunting monsters. He questioned whether the other students would have the same capability. Looking back, the professor observed the students struggling to move without making noise. Annoyed, Rent instructed them that they must walk much slower than they were. He stated that if they made no noise, they would be safe and should maintain that slow pace. Rent informed them that they could not camp in the water lizards' territory, and the students showed exhaustion. Noticing the lack of instructions on how to proceed, Gray Lee assumed they had been taught about safe locations before the training. That level of noise was not enough, and the professor reiterated that they should make sure not to produce loud noises. Everyone continued the march, and the professor warned that from the next point onward, they should no longer speak. Furthermore, any noise or speech would result in a loss of points in their evaluation. They continued the march, communicating only through hand signals. Even without being able to make noise, the students considered it a typical mountain trail. With a slower pace than the previous day, the task could even become easy. For this reason, the academy students believed there would be no monsters there. They even doubted that the academy would put them in training with monsters capable of eliminating them. They assumed that the existence of the monsters was a hoax, merely to practice marching at that pace. Suddenly, one of the students slipped on a rock, falling to the ground and producing a slightly louder noise. The student believed the monsters would not appear, but feared losing points in the evaluation. However, in moments, water lizards began to run around the group. Everyone, professors and students, drew their swords, realizing the creature's approach. The boy who had fallen was in complete shock upon seeing something advancing towards him. The wild lizards leaped onto the group of students. Professor Heathcote intervened, striking down the water lizards with his sword, plunging it into the head of one of them and eliminating it instantly. However, another lizard, still alive, advanced fiercely against the students. Leon attacked the lizard, striking its skin with his sword, but not even a scratch was left on its body. Immediately, the creature changed its target and charged at Leon. At that moment, Professor Heathcote arrived to protect the student, delivering a punch to the beast. He stated that the students would not be able to face those creatures and ordered everyone to retreat. The professors began to surround the water lizards and instructed the students to move away. The students noticed that even the professors could only inflict superficial wounds on the lizards, realizing they did not have the necessary skill level to defeat those creatures. The professor explained that if they could make them lose a little body fluid, they would bring them down due to the dry season. Leon asked what would happen if they encountered these monsters during the rainy season. The professor replied that at that time of year, they would become easy prey for the water lizards. For this reason, the training march only took place after the complete confirmation of no rain. He added that they could now talk, as all the surrounding water lizards had been eliminated. Otherwise, merely talking would have already led to their deaths. They continued the march, climbing the mountain. Finally, they reached the top of the climb, defeating a few more creatures along the way. When Professor Heathcote announced the end of the mountain march, the students collapsed to the ground, exhausted. Leon felt physically well, but mentally exhausted. The fact that they could not make loud noises also made the march much more difficult. Everyone found the training very tough, but Leon showed no reaction. Professor Heathcote commented that, in recent years, the water lizard ambushes had been much worse. He added that once they passed their territory, they would not be able to speak again, and asked if any student had a question. Graylee said something was bothering him, observing that a cloud in the sky was getting slightly larger and approaching them. Professor Heathcote noticed the observation and spoke with Professor Wormel about the clouds. Wormel said that it was normally impossible for such clouds to form during that season. They realized the cloud was growing even larger and decided to turn back, canceling the training. However, Professor Wormel argued that they should continue the training even with the approaching rain. Heathcote countered that the existence of a cloud at that time of year was abnormal and that the students' safety should be preserved, as it mattered more than training. Professor Wormel, who had conducted the training for years, argued that they should trust his decision. Professor Wormel, the one with the mustache, said they would accelerate the pace of the march because of the rain. He considered it a good training opportunity and that the students should follow him as if their lives depended on it. He stated that, based on the training results so far, they would be able to proceed in the rain. He instructed them not to fall behind and not to waste time fighting the lizards. Finally, he firmly said that they should not make any noise. As Gray observed, a torrential rain began to fall from the sky. Heathcote found the rain strange and noticed the high humidity in the air. He suspected the rain was artificial, perhaps created by magic. Even Professor Wormel found it odd that it was raining that season, as it shouldn't have been happening. Leon asked Professor Wormwool if it was safe to speak loudly in a place like that. At that very moment, a fierce water lizard appeared behind Professor Wormwool. The water lizard struck the professor with full force. The creature delivered a heavy attack, but Professor Wormel managed to dodge and immediately counterattacked. In the counterattack, he managed to embed his sword into the beast's arm. The creature let out a very loud shriek and retaliated with a tail whip. Then Professor Wormel used his sword to block the attack. He managed to inflict some damage on the lizard and was then thrown away. Everyone was worried about Professor Wormel, who managed to get back on his feet. Leon thought that a professor's reflexes should be quick enough to dodge such attacks, and yet his Professor Wormel was badly hurt, even while focused on counterattacking. The students were shocked to see the speed of these water lizards. Even knowing this, the lizard's movement was faster than in dry weather conditions. Heathcote told all the students to stay focused, and they advanced against the lizard. Along with the other professors, he charged, armed and ready to eliminate the beasts. He delivered a blow to the monster's back. However, Professor Heathcote was caught off guard by a tail whip from the lizard and was also thrown away. The lizard advanced on him, but Professor Heathcote quickly got up, eliminating the creature. The four professors, acting together, finally managed to defeat the monsters. However, all the professors were injured, unable to continue with the training in that state. Wormel then canceled the training and instructed everyone to use an emergency teleportation spell. The female professor revealed that she had been trying to activate the spell for quite some time, but it simply wasn't working. One of the professors asked if anyone else present could cast such a spell. Another professor explained that the problem persisted because the teleport seemed to be blocked. Besides the incessant rain and the blocked teleportation, there was a suspicion that someone was targeting that specific exit. Wormel was shocked, wondering what they could do to escape that place. One of the professors suggested that the only option was to stop there and wait for the rain to cease. Professor Heathcote pondered that there was a chance the rain was artificial and would therefore stop at some point. They concluded that the chances of survival would be higher if they remained in place, rather than trying to fight with the strength they had. The previous battle fortunately had occurred without casualties. Trusting that Professor Heathcote had also realized the situation, they hurried to heal Wormhole. The activity range of the water lizards, however, increased considerably during the rain. Heathcote, aware that staying put would not be safe, began to think of a way out of that situation. At that moment, Gray raised his voice and addressed the professor. He stated that as long as recovery magic existed, he could fight alongside them. Heathcote agreed that, with the boy's power, there would be a chance to cross the water lizard's territory. There were chances that Gray's body could handle and withstand the fights. Gray knew that the professor understood that if they remained there, help would not arrive. Heathcote, however, warned that even with recovery magic, Gray would have to use that mode more than once a day. This went against Ariel's clear instructions, who had forbidden Gray from doing so. Gray, however, considered that the perfect moment to train. With excellent healers at the academy, he was willing to risk everything. Heathcote argued that Ariel would have asked him to stop if it was something that could be easily healed. Gray, however, retorted that there was no other way to send the students back safely. He questioned whether the professor would allow everyone to be eliminated there, just to protect him. Ariel had warned Heathcote that Gray would try to sacrifice himself for the greater good. She had asked the professor not to let him do anything irreversible. After analyzing the situation, Heathcote decided to go against Ariel's words and asked Gray to fight alongside them. Gray Lee agreed, but Wormhole intervened, telling them not to decide things on their own. She acknowledged that Gray had performed well in the competition, but warned that they should not entrust the lives of everyone present to a single student. Heathcote, however, stated that with Gray's power, he would be able to handle a water lizard by himself. For this reason, the professor believed they should put all their chips on the boy's mysterious power. Professor Morgan, however, could not allow such a situation. He insisted that sending a rescue request to headquarters was the safest option. Galak, however, had already sent the request to headquarters, but communication was being blocked at that moment. Professor Galak was proactive as always, but they needed to await headquarters' response. The mustachioed professor argued that moving on their own would only increase the risk. He questioned whether Heathcote truly wanted to put the students in danger. He warned that they would not be able to withstand more attacks from the wild creatures. Therefore, they should wait for reinforcements to arrive, which would be safer than wandering outside the safe zone. He instructed the students to make less noise as other creatures might smell their voices. The students remained sheltered under the trees, waiting for the rain to pass, until new water lizards appeared, leaving everyone in shock. Meanwhile, Professor Heathcote armed himself with his sword, preparing for combat. Gray Lee also prepared to fight alongside the professors, wielding his sword. As soon as the beasts appeared, suddenly leaping, everyone launched their attack. At high speed, the professors attacked the creatures from the front and back with their swords, until one of the professors was hit by a lizard's tail whip, suffering considerable damage. In response, Heathcote charged at the lizard and delivered several attacks with absurd speed. Together, they managed to take down one of the water lizards. Immediately, one of the professors used healing magic on the colleague who had been hit by the lizard's tail. Meanwhile, two other lizards, attracted by the sounds of battle, advanced towards them. Our hero then prepared to draw his sword. Heathcote declared that their duty was to protect the students, and that the World Union professors fought in that manner. Thus, with insane speed and a heroic pose, they advanced against the beasts. The students watched the fight against the lizards, impressed by how powerful the professors were. Even fighting against two enemies, they handled the situation perfectly, demonstrating the true power of the professors. Heathcote instructed them to focus on taking down only one of the lizards first, in order to reduce the number of adversaries. Immediately, they focused on dodging attacks and concentrating on just one of the lizards. One of the professors managed to plunge his sword into the creature's chest. The students celebrated the defeat of another monster by the professors, with only one remaining now. They noticed that the professors had suffered little damage, and the healer was taking care of them. They believed that the World Union professors would win the combat. It was then that the professors advanced against the last lizard. However, from behind the professors, two men armed with swords unexpectedly appeared. The two professors had their arms amputated. Gray Lee was responsible, amputating both professors with a single strike. The students were in shock while Gray Lee continued his attacks. Heathcote thanked the protagonist for his action. Meanwhile, he and the remaining professor would keep the lizards busy. As soon as they finished off the last lizard, the professor prepared to interrogate the two traitors. He asked what exactly they were trying to do by attacking Heathcote from behind. He ordered them to explain their intentions. Lying, Warmel claimed he was fighting the lizard when his arm was torn off. The other professor, a robust man, repeated the same version and demanded that they arrest the criminal Gray Lee. The remaining professor stated that everyone there had noticed the two's attempt at betrayal. He added that the fencing students were not so blind as to let something so obvious go unnoticed. Heathcote mentioned that assassination attempts and kidnappings of Academy members were not uncommon. As the Academy was an organization with various enemies and individuals of great value, such incidents occurred frequently. He realized that the traitors tried to use the fight as a distraction to eliminate a professor. And, with the guards absent, they planned to eliminate the students or kidnap them to force them into questionable work. Upon hearing the two professors' plan, the fencing students were in shock. Heathcote stated that they survived thanks to Gray Lee's quick thinking. The protagonist understood that the professor had already noticed the situation from the beginning. Heathcote had already noticed the two professors' attempt at betrayal. Ormo asked if their plan had leaked at any point. Gray Lee found it easy to perceive someone's intentions just by observing their movements and eyes. The way the mustachioed man moved indicated that he was trying to attack, not protect the students and professors. Until halfway through the process, Gray Lee thought he was just useless, but when the rain started, he understood the strangeness of his behavior. Suffering attacks he could have easily dodged, among other actions, made him suspicious. The hero used his power for a second, and the injury did not seem that serious. It looked more like a serious bruise, and his body was not sore. At that moment, the professor seemed to have gone mad and began to cackle like a villain. He told Gray Lee and Reed that it was already too late, that they had not realized the true plan, and that they were trapped in a habitat infested with aquatic lizards under the rain. Furthermore, a powerful teleportation seal had been activated to prevent any escape, and reinforcements would not arrive in time. Even if they had realized the two traitors' plan, he considered it too late for them to get out alive, stating that all the students there would die. However, the objective was never to eliminate them, but rather to take them along so they would understand the plan. Heathcote wanted to hear the plan of how they would get out of there, according to the man with the mustache. However, Warmel's condition was that Rent, Heathcote, and Gray Lee stabbed themselves in the heart. After all, they could not take anyone who could interfere with the plan. If they did, the others would survive. Warmel tried to manipulate them, asking if they would hesitate with so many lives at stake. At that moment, another person emerged from the shadows, and the protagonist moved behind him. Coming from behind, he pointed his sword at the man's throat in an instant. Using the man as a hostage, Warmel declared that this would change nothing. The protagonist pressured the man, knowing that he possessed the ability to use teleportation magic. He stated that performing stealthy communication and teleportation interference in the academy was difficult, but with the professor in charge of magic by his side, it would be much easier to implement such a system. Heathcote stated that Gray Lee was very perceptive for a student. Immediately, Gray Lee pointed his sword at the professor who possessed teleportation and communication abilities, ordering him to activate the teleportation magic immediately and send all students and professors to the foot of the mountain. If he refused, he would lose one of his eyes. If he persisted in his refusal, the other eye would also be gouged out. Next, Gray Lee threatened to cut off all the fingers from the professor's hand. Gray Lee threatened him, saying that if he sent a student to a different location or left anyone behind, he would regret it. Warmel ordered Professor Galak not to dare conjure the teleportation magic. However, the professor was being threatened by two swords simultaneously and hesitated. At that moment, Professor Heathcote declared he had no more options and attacked him with everything he had. However, Professor Rant fell to his knees on the ground, avoiding the attack, and began to cry. He placed both hands on the ground and activated the teleportation magic, which encompassed all the students. The teleportation was activated, and all the students returned to the base of the mountain. There, the first-year fencing course squad appeared at the academy's door. Rich explained that during their stay in the lizard habitat, the situation became dangerously anomalous, requiring evacuation. The cause of this emergency was an assassination attempt orchestrated by faculty members. He added that two magic professors were involved, accompanying Warmel. All the students confirmed Professor Rich's version of the assassination attempt against them. They stated that they were in a life-threatening situation. Leon then declared that Gray Lee and Professor Heathcote realized the scheme and saved everyone. An older professor asked if anyone was injured and if they needed immediate treatment. The healer approached and noticed that the two professors were missing their right hands. To prevent the escape of potential informants, she temporarily handcuffed everyone present. Then, she stated that all students would be interrogated and told them to prepare for it. The professors were interrogated individually. The interrogation was conducted by the academy's professors and directors. After confirming the stories, everyone waited in the courtroom. Director Alexandro struck the gavel, calling for silence in the courtroom. He announced the verdict regarding the attempted assassination and kidnapping of the first-year squad. The incident was orchestrated by Wormel, the excursion supervisor, and Balin, his accomplice. Furthermore, they had the assistance of two magic professors designated for emergency situations, Galak and Rant, who, within the enclosed environment they created, attempted to kidnap the students. These three professors acted in the execution of a criminal plan during the event. With no other circumstances to be analyzed, the Academy's laws sentenced the three. The traitorous professors were sentenced to capital punishment, according to the Academy's laws. To investigate possible connections and accomplices, they would be interrogated, including with torture, if necessary. After the conclusion of the process, the executions would be carried out. The director added that they would not die quickly, as they still had a long process ahead of them. When Armand stated that he had already told everything he knew and did not need interrogation, the director looked at him sternly. Feeling a dark energy emanating from the director, Armand tried to flee the courtroom. A professor grabbed him and violently threw him to the ground. Heathcote was injured during the fall. The director, highly irritated, ordered the three main culprits to be taken for interrogation. Galak was also guilty, but in the final moments, he abandoned the plans and helped the students. This was enough for a reduced sentence, and he would emerge alive as one of the condemned. He helped the students escape in the end, which minimized collateral damage, and for this reason, he would not be executed. However, living is not always the best fate, as Galak would face many consequences. Heathcote understood that Gray Lee had to go through something difficult soon after entering the academy, but he noticed that Gray Lee was getting used to being involved in such problems, as it had happened before. Heathcote never imagined that so many criminals would be hidden as professors in the academy. He found it hard to believe that this place was supposed to be the best educational institution in the world. To him, it was nothing like what he had in mind before entering the academy. Heathcote commented that some people considered the academy an educational institution, while others saw it more as a selection institution, where already strong students entered, and graduates were excellent because they already possessed that quality. Meanwhile, the professors did not possess much power, and Heathcote asked the student for his opinion. Gray Lee replied that he sometimes thought about that exact factor. One thing he was sure of was that he had grown stronger since coming to that academy, much stronger than he was in his village before, without even a comparison. He agreed with the professor about not trusting the academy as an organization. However, there were professors there who were extremely trustworthy, like Heathcote and Ariel. For Gray Lee, that was already more than enough. Heathcote felt that Gray Lee was not speaking as a student, but rather as someone who liked both of them. He told the boy that, from now on, the academy's training would become much more difficult. Everything he had done before was light conditioning, practically a warm-up for what was to come. Heathcote stated that Gray Lee would become much stronger from that point forward. Gray Lee very much hoped so, as that was the greatest goal of his life. They were congratulated for their work on the field march. Despite the irregular situations, everyone received congratulations. With this march, they officially completed their basic physical training. Before explaining the next phase of the process, Heathcote would show what he aimed for the students. He demonstrated the professors' training and their very powerful abilities. One of the professors destroyed a piece of metal 145 millimeters in diameter. The professor explained that if they could replicate that feat in a single cut, they would be promoted directly to the second year. If they failed to achieve this goal by the end of the semester, they would be expelled. Annually, half of the students failed to complete the task and were dismissed from the academy. The professor emphasized that few students graduated from the World Union Academy, and it was common for many to give up or be expelled. He continued, detailing that the path after expulsion depended on the year it occurred. If a student was expelled in the first year, they would be transferred to a common academy in their hometown. Thanks to the prior training received, they would advance a year without difficulty, standing out as the best student in the class. If they preferred to work instead of transferring, they could join the Royal Guard as an elite swordsman. In the eyes of the public, those accepted into the World Union Academy were no longer considered ordinary people. Even the expelled still possessed talent, just not as proficient as those who progressed. Gray Lee remembered what his master Arya had said about the chasm between the World Union Academy and other institutions. The professor advised the students not to worry about the possibility of expulsion, but rather to focus on cutting the pillar. The students then asked if it was truly possible to cut that structure. The professor handed a sword to one of the students and instructed him to test it himself. The young man struck the pillar, but the sword flew from his hand. After the impact, he felt an intense pain in his wrist due to the rebound effect. The professor reprimanded him, stating that letting go of the sword was unacceptable, as a swordsman should never drop their blade. Gray Lee asked if they could use a specific sword, mentioning that if he used the one Ariel had given him, he could easily do it. However, the professor replied that only swords meeting the Academy's standard would be allowed. Gray Lee considered that with his current sword, he could probably make the cut at that moment, using his mysterious power. However, if that was a requirement for promotion, it should be done without using his special ability. He thought about how to combine his technique with his strength to achieve the goal. Gray Lee understood that with his power, he could reach the level of an executioner in the future. Recalling the incident from his past life, he reaffirmed the need to become stronger. The professor, noticing the students' apprehension, said he knew they were wondering if it was truly possible to cut something like that with a sword, or if they needed inhuman strength like Gray Lee's to pass the year. He clarified that this was not the case, as the veteran teachers were much stronger than Gray Lee. Even without significant physical distinctions, the power difference between the students and the teachers was absurd. The reason lay in the infusion of life force, channeled into the sword. Gray Lee had heard about this in his past life. Life force was used to refine super-compressed ether. The World Union Academy must have developed a technique to apply this to swordsmanship, and now they would teach the students how to do it. The professor explained that in modern times, it was not necessary to understand complicated theories to use these techniques. He then showed a draining demonic sword, which forced life energy to channel into the blade. Once they got used to the sensation, they would be able to do the same with normal swords. He asked if anyone wanted to try, but the other students hesitated, preferring someone else to go first to see what would happen with the draining sword. Gray Lee found the sword's name strange, but he decided to test it to become stronger. The moment he raised his hand to volunteer, Leon also raised his. Leon was indignant because he hadn't been able to do anything when the water lizards attacked. The professor knew Gray Lee could handle the sword, but he wouldn't be a good reference for the other students. Thus, he asked Leon to step forward and try using the draining demonic sword. The prodigy held the sword and felt something being drained from within him. The professor instructed him to launch the attack immediately after taking the sword, and then sheath it. Leonhard attacked the pillar with the sword, cutting it halfway through. With the insane power he managed to use, the cut almost destroyed the pillar. However, the rebound effect was absurd, and he fell unconscious to the ground. Leon managed to sheathe the sword, but he crawled on the ground without strength. The teachers rushed to him to check his condition. Professor Rent said that it was like this at first, and that they shouldn't push themselves too hard. The condition of life force exhaustion was temporary. He added that Leon would recover after resting, and that his performance had been better than expected. After all, the young man hadn't even dropped the sword. Next, he called Gray Lee to try. The students were impressed that Gray Lee hadn't hesitated, even after seeing Leon fall. With an above-average level of determination, Gray Lee took the sword and drew it from its sheath. He noticed that something was indeed draining his life force, and that he wouldn't be able to endure it for long. Our protagonist advanced toward the pillar, delivering a very powerful and swift cut. However, not even he managed to destroy the pillar completely. Gray Lee realized that it wasn't like drawing a sword normally. It felt as if the blood in his body was completely frozen. Gray Lee sheathes the sword and sighs, as if he were completely fine. It's the first time Professor Rent has seen a freshman not fall to their knees after using the demonic sword. Gray Lee has more energy reserves than expected, thanks to Heathcote's training. Or perhaps his body had become accustomed to the damage from being constantly exhausted. Professor Rent asks Gray Lee if he could repeat the feat. Gray Lee tries again, draws the sword, and attacks the pillar. However, his eyes close and consciousness abandons him. At least he manages to sheathe the sword before completely passing out. Rent says he was just joking and didn't think Gray Lee would try to attack again with the demonic sword. He understands how Gray Lee achieved such an absurd level of strength for his age. While waiting for the two to recover, Rent goes to talk with the rest of the students in the class. He demonstrates that swordsmanship utilizing life force is incredibly powerful. Even a novice, upon wielding the sword for the first time, can almost destroy a steel stake. This technique is properly taught only at the World Union Academy. No other national academy teaches it. He asks if any student knows the reason. A student suggests it is due to the risk of death when using the life-draining sword. However, Professor Rent clarifies that no student has ever died using this sword. He explains that the sword stops draining life force as soon as the person loses consciousness. Leon Apius believes the reason is the sword's rarity. Rent replies that this is not the main reason, as the academy possesses 30 of them. In the past, its use in combat resulted in countless deaths. This was why its use was restricted to the academy. If a user cannot move on the battlefield, even if the sword stops draining life force, the enemy will eliminate them. To use this power in real combat, it is essential to be able to move after wielding it. Gray Lee states that there is no one outside the academy capable of such a feat. Professor Rent agrees with Lee, stating that activating the sword only once is useless. One can only say they have mastered the sword's power when its use becomes second nature. Otherwise, it is not the student who uses the sword's power, but rather its power that uses the student. This is how countless swordsmen lost their lives using the draining demonic swords. The academy students ask if they should really use such a dangerous weapon. It is explained that everyone needs to learn to use this power naturally to advance to the second year. Rent announces that he will use these swords in the next training session with the students. He dismisses the students so they can also practice outside of class, asking them not to faint and delay the day's other classes. Gray Lee needs to figure out how to use this power normally. After all, becoming unconscious after a single use is completely useless. The same applies to his chained doors ability. Every time he uses that secret power, he ends up losing consciousness. At this rate, he will need a healer. At the very least, he will have to ensure he can use one of these powers to defeat the Liquidator. This convinces him that going to the academy was the best choice of his life. There is no better place for him to grow stronger. He knows he will become a monster by combining this power with his secret technique. At the second training ground, the students are seen. One of them observes Gray Lee almost dismantling the pillar with a series of cuts. He takes a 3-minute break every time he swings the sword. Life force recovery accompanies mana consumption. Gray Lee got the hang of it. Although training this way is inefficient, he decides to test the normal sword, even feeling that collapse will come without breaks. Gray Lee does not want to forget the sensation that remained in his body. As he is about to draw his sword again, someone interrupts him. A student informs him that Professor Ariel asked him to try using the Life Force sword on his own. However, she would like to be present, and the student goes to call her, asking Gray Lee to wait. Gray Lee waits for Professor Ariel, whom he thought was busy. The student assumes that the professor predicted he would master the sword, and cleared her schedule in advance. Gray Lee is surprised that she predicted he would master the art of the sword in just one day. He already expected this coming from the Divine Eye, but he is still surprised. Ariel apologizes for making him wait and asks him to resume his sword training. Beside her is a hooded woman whose unknown face leaves Gray Lee indignant. Ariel, imagining he is tired, says that the team is there to heal him. Gray Lee relied on their support to regain his vitality after using the sword. He decided to train first with the magical life-draining sword to recall the sensation. Ariel watched intently, allowing him to act according to his intuition. Gray performed another spinning move with the demon energy-draining sword. Then, he advanced towards the pillar and delivered another cut that almost destroyed it. He was trying to understand and recover the sensation he had experienced before. Wielding a normal sword, Gray tried to recreate the sensation of drawing life force from his own body. Focused, he tried to remember, and felt the vital fluid from his heart begin to flow through his body. As the vital energy from his heart flowed through the sword, imbuing it, something unexpected occurred. Suddenly, Gray's arm turned completely red, imbued with the energy of the Black Swordsman. This energy, distinct from life force, had mixed with it. Gray's life force was merging with the power emanating from that door, and the latter seemed thirsty for more life energy. Consequently, his life force was being drained against his will. He couldn't control anything, and suffered from the uncontrolled manifestation of his power. Suddenly, Gray's arm was torn off by a swordsman from the academy. It was clear that his arm was completely imbued with a monstrous energy. By being torn off, the imminent danger was contained. Ariel knew that special powers had problematic compatibilities with life forces. It was said that the previous wielder of the Divine Eye also faced difficulties in harmonizing his power with life force. The woman who had torn off Gray's arm was the healing magic teacher, Rafa Elixir. Rafa found Gray's power excessively strange while healing him. First, she stopped the bleeding, and then activated the forced regeneration healing magic. Gray's right arm, which had been removed, began to grow back. Bones, fibers, and muscles reformed and reconnected. Ariel considered forced regeneration a magnificent technique. Rafa was genuinely happy to have dedicated herself to the field of healing. She thanked Professor Ariel for discovering her talent for healing. Rafa believed that Gray Lee would wake up in a few hours and instructed them to call her if anything unexpected happened. Gray Lee woke up in a strange place he didn't recognize. Professor Ariel sat beside him and asked if he remembered what had happened. Gray Lee recalled that when he tried to activate the Life Force sword, the power in his arm had gone out of control. His life force had been completely drained, and the Destiny Assistant had torn off his arm. Gray was shocked to find that his arm had grown back and he didn't remember what happened next. Ariel noticed that his memory was intact and handed him food. Gray ate and asked if she already knew that would happen. Ariel replied that she wasn't sure, but something similar had happened before. She cited the incident where Amy White tried to use life force. For that reason, Ariel had decided to be present when Gray used his life force. Gray was very surprised to learn that the same thing had happened to the Sword Saint Amy White. Ariel explained that in Amy's case, unable to withstand the mixed power, her arm exploded. Gray was shocked to hear that the Sword Saint's arm had exploded and that the same had not happened to him. For this reason, it wasn't necessary to amputate it, but the shock she suffered was immense. It seems she still has an aversion to using her life force to this day. Gray understood that despite the aversion, she had somehow learned to use the power. Professor Ariel confirmed this, although she had faced many difficulties in mastering this power. Gray asked what method the professor had used at the time. Ariel explained that she had used a magic contract to suppress the Sword Saint's power. They gradually loosened the magic contract while Amy trained, allowing her to manifest only her life force. The magic contract surprised Gray, who didn't know it possessed such a function. Professor Ariel, however, said that this magic was not suitable for suppressing this type of alien power and would not work with Gray. Even Amy's power didn't last 3 minutes before the magic contract collapsed. Against Gray's power, it would be lucky if it lasted half a second. In other words, the same method could not be used with Gray. Professor Ariel regretted not being able to find a way for Gray to use his life force, as he possessed such a unique alien power, without precedents or formulas for reference. She added that it wasn't impossible for him to use his life force, but he would need to accumulate enough training to be able to use and extract only the life force. However, she couldn't conceive of a method that would support so much training, as the life force would spiral out of control. Gray considered that if the power went out of control every time, it would be impossible to practice. He thought of asking someone to sever his arm every time the power went out of control and use recovery magic. He believed he could train if she could provide recovery magic for him every time. Professor Ariel was speechless at Gray's bizarre idea. She said she could provide someone to use recovery magic, but asked if he really wanted to go through with this plan, as there was the option of not using this life force at all. Gray's power, after all, surpassed that of the life-draining sword itself. With his abilities alone, he could pass the Ascension exam, even without resorting to life force. However, Gray's goal went far beyond simply becoming a second-year student. He sought ways to strengthen himself, even if only a little each year. Professor Eliel already expected this answer from Gray. Therefore, she would provide recovery magic and someone to perform the cut whenever he lost control. First, Gray wished to wield the life-draining magic sword to sharpen his senses. Next, he would need someone for the task of severing his arm. The professor instructed the observers to act immediately if Gray lost control. Although the arm's regeneration could take until the next day, his life would not be at risk. It would be an unimaginably agonizing training regimen. But Professor Eliel was rooting for Gray in this process. Gray thanked the professor for her support in his peculiar plan to achieve greater strength. Meanwhile, the other students showed great difficulty in manipulating life force to knock down the pillars. They felt they were starting to understand, but the sword made them faint with each strike. Therefore, they ended their training after only 30 minutes, as the sword left them completely exhausted. If they pushed themselves too hard, they could end up ruining their bodies. As they withdrew, they noticed Gray appearing with 2 swords. They realized that Gray hadn't fainted once, and that his stamina was on a completely different level from theirs. When they returned to the training ground in the morning, Gray was already there, wielding the swords. They were shocked to discover that he had been using the life-draining magic sword since early morning. Although they knew he was the best student at the academy, they wondered if they had seen wrong. Another student supposed that he was just practicing just a little and with breaks, because bodies become completely exhausted after only 30 minutes of training. They thought that if Gray continued non-stop from morning until night, he would certainly die. At that moment, Gray switched swords, fainted, and fell unconscious to the ground. He had thought he would get the hang of it if he continued to use the sword tirelessly. Gray felt that he wasn't understanding anything about the training with the demonic draining sword. After all, the teacher hadn't taught him this training method. It was just his rudimentary and self-taught training method put into practice. He wondered if he could extract his life force without the need for the sword. Gray started to remember the liquidator and pushed away the negative thoughts. He should go all the way and complete that training. Gray closed his eyes, fully concentrating on the ability to absorb life force. Drawing the sword from its sheath, he delivered a perfect cut that destroyed the pillar. He wondered if it was the first time he had managed to completely sever a new and massive pillar. With that, Gray realized that he had used his normal sword and the life force ability on it.